The emergence of Abhuman strains represents one of the most enduring consequences of humanity's near extinction during the Age of Strife. When warp storms consumed the galaxy and severed mankind's interstellar empire, thousands of human colonies found themselves isolated for millennia. Cut off from the homeworld and each other, these populations faced environments that would reshape them in fundamental ways. The process was neither quick nor uniform, but the result was unmistakable. Humanity began to fracture into distinct subspecies, each bearing the marks of their particular crucible of survival. The mechanisms driving this divergence operated on multiple fronts simultaneously. Environmental adaptation proved the most straightforward factor. Human colonies established during the Dark Age of technology had spread across worlds spanning every conceivable climate and atmospheric composition. Populations on high-gravity worlds developed denser bone structures and more compact frames. Those on low-gravity planets saw their descendants grow taller and more elongated. Worlds with toxic atmospheres or unusual radiation signatures imposed their own selective pressures. Generation after generation, the human genome bent and shifted to accommodate these new realities. Genetic drift compounded these environmental factors. Small founding populations, sometimes numbering only a few thousand individuals, carried limited genetic diversity. Random mutations that might have been diluted in larger gene pools instead became fixed traits. Isolated communities developed distinctive characteristics not through any adaptive advantage, but simply through the mathematical inevitability of limited breeding populations. Some of these changes remained superficial, affecting only appearance. Others ran deeper, altering metabolic processes, sensory capabilities, or cognitive function. The warp itself left its fingerprints on human evolution during this period. The same storms that isolated humanity also saturated real space with unprecedented levels of psychic energy. Populations living on worlds where the barrier between materium and immaterium grew thin experienced mutations that defied conventional genetic explanation. These warp-touch changes sometimes manifested as psychic sensitivity, but more often produced stranger alterations, unusual organ development, inexplicable physiological capabilities, or characteristics that seemed to violate standard biological principles. The distinction between warp-induced mutation and natural adaptation became a source of endless debate among Imperial scholars in later ages. When the Emperor launched the Great Crusade from Terra, his armies encountered the full spectrum of humanity's diversification. Some Abhuman strains had diverged so far that initial contact teams struggled to recognize them as human at all. Others remained close enough to baseline humanity that their differences seemed trivial. The Imperium faced an immediate classificatory challenge: which of these variant populations deserved recognition as human, and which had strayed too far from the species to warrant inclusion in the new galactic order. The Adeptus Terra developed a classification system that attempted to impose order on this biological chaos. The system distinguished between stable Abhuman strains and condemned mutants through a series of criteria that balanced genetic, practical, and political considerations. Stability formed the foundation of acceptability. An Abhuman strain qualified as stable only if it bred true across generations, producing offspring that consistently displayed the same characteristics as their parents. Populations exhibiting high mutation rates or unpredictable genetic expression faced immediate classification as unstable mutant stocks, regardless of any other factors. Utility to the Imperium provided the second major criterion. The Administratum maintained no interest in preserving Abhuman strains as curiosities or for purely academic purposes. Each recognized strain needed to demonstrate clear value to Imperial operations. This typically meant military service, though some strains earned recognition through specialized labor capabilities or survival in environments that killed baseline humans. The calculus was brutally pragmatic. Abhumans who could fill roles that baseline humans could not, or who could perform standard tasks with greater efficiency, warranted tolerance. Those offering no clear advantage faced a much harder path to acceptance. The official list of sanctioned Abhuman strains remained surprisingly short given humanity's vast diaspora. Ogryns earned recognition for their tremendous strength and resilience, making them valuable shock troops despite their limited intelligence. Ratlings gained acceptance due to their exceptional marksmanship and utility as scouts and snipers. Squats, before their apparent extinction, held recognition as skilled miners and craftsmen. Beastmen occupied an ambiguous position, sometimes tolerated for labor or military service on frontier worlds, but never fully embraced. Felinids, longshanks, pelagers, and troths appeared in various imperial records, though their status and prevalence varied wildly depending on which bureaucratic authority one consulted. The classification process involved extensive documentation and investigation. When imperial forces encountered a potential Abhuman population, local authorities submitted detailed reports to the administratum. These reports documented physical characteristics, breeding patterns, cognitive capabilities, cultural practices, and any relevant historical information about the population's origins. The Adeptus Terra reviewed these submissions with grinding slowness, sometimes taking decades or even centuries to render official judgment. During this liminal period, the population in question existed in legal uncertainty, their fate dependent on bureaucratic processes operating across vast interstellar distances. The Adeptus Ministorum viewed the Abhuman question through an entirely different lens, where the administratum concerned itself with genetic stability and practical utility. The ecclesiarchy grappled with fundamental theological questions. The imperial creed proclaimed the emperor as the guardian and perfecter of humanity, but what exactly constituted humanity? Did Abhumans, with their divergent forms and altered genomes, retain sufficient connection to baseline human stock to claim a place in the emperor's plan? More critically, did they possess souls capable of salvation, or had their physical corruption extended into the spiritual realm? These questions generated fierce debate within the Ministorum. Conservative factions argued that any deviation from the human template represented degradation, a falling away from the emperor's intended form. They pointed to the obvious physical differences between Abhumans and baseline humans as evidence of fundamental corruption. If the emperor had created humanity in a specific image, these theologians reasoned, then departures from that image suggested spiritual as well as physical imperfection. This view led to the conclusion that Abhumans occupied a lesser position in the cosmic hierarchy, perhaps deserving of the emperor's mercy, but certainly not equal to true humans. Progressive elements within the ecclesiarchy countered that the emperor's domain extended over all of humanity, and that genetic variation did not necessarily indicate spiritual deficiency. They argued that the emperor's Great Crusade had sought to reunite all of scattered humanity, making no initial distinction between baseline and variant populations. The fact that the emperor's own forces had incorporated Abhumans during the Great Crusade suggested divine acceptance of their essential humanity. These theologians emphasized the importance of faith and loyalty over physical form, arguing that an Abhuman who served the emperor with devotion possessed more spiritual worth than a genetically pure human who turned from the imperial faith. The debate extended into practical religious matters. Could Abhumans serve as priests? Should they receive the same sacraments as baseline humans? Did they require special prayers or rituals to ensure their souls reached the emperor's side after death? Different dioceses answered these questions differently, creating a patchwork of local practices across the Imperium. Some worlds welcomed Abhumans into their congregations without reservation. Others segregated them into separate services or barred them from holy sites entirely. The ecclesiarchy's central leadership issued periodic pronouncements attempting to standardize practice, but enforcement across millions of worlds proved impossible. The Adeptus Mechanicus approached Abhumans with characteristic detachment, viewing them primarily as biological data requiring analysis and categorization. The Genitor Biologes, that branch of the Mechanicus devoted to biological study, maintained extensive records on every known Abhuman strain. Their forged temples housed vast archives containing genetic samples, physiological measurements, and behavioral observations accumulated over millennia. These tech priests saw Abhumans not as theological problems or administrative challenges, but as expressions of the human genome's plasticity under varying environmental conditions. Genitor teams accompanied many Imperial expeditions specifically to document and analyze newly encountered populations. They collected tissue samples, conducted breeding experiments, and performed detailed genetic sequencing to determine the exact nature and extent of deviation from baseline human stock. Their reports formed the scientific foundation for the Adeptus Terra's classification decisions, though political and practical considerations often overrode pure genetic analysis. A genitor might determine that a particular population showed dangerous genetic instability, only to see the administratum grant provisional acceptance because the Abhumans in question controlled valuable resources or occupied strategically important territory. The Mechanicus also conducted ongoing research into the mechanisms underlying Abhuman development. They sought to understand which environmental factors produced which genetic changes, whether certain mutations could be induced or reversed, and what limits existed on human genetic plasticity. Some genitor factions pursued experiments aimed at creating new Abhuman strains optimized for specific tasks or environments. These efforts operated in legal and ethical gray areas, as the Imperium officially frowned upon deliberate genetic manipulation of human stock, but the Mechanicus often interpreted regulations with considerable flexibility when pursuing knowledge. The question of acceptability standards remained contentious even within the Mechanicus itself. Some genitors argued for strict criteria based purely on genetic distance from baseline human norms. They developed complex mathematical models measuring the degree of divergence and proposed hard thresholds beyond which a population should face classification as non-human. Other tech priests favored more flexible approaches that considered functional capabilities and adaptive advantages alongside pure genetic metrics. These debates generated endless technical papers and theological biological treatises that circulated through Mechanicus networks, influencing but never fully resolving the classification process. The classification debates surrounding Abhumans found their clearest practical expression in the case of Ogryns, whose extreme physical divergence from baseline humanity made them impossible to overlook, yet whose utility to Imperial military operations proved equally undeniable. These massive Abhumans emerged from human populations stranded on high-gravity worlds during the Age of Strife, where survival demanded radical physiological adaptation. The crushing gravitational forces of their homeworlds reshaped human biology over thousands of generations, producing beings that bore only superficial resemblance to their baseline ancestors, while remaining recognizably human in their fundamental genetic architecture. The typical Ogryn stands between 2.5 to 3 meters tall, with some exceptional specimens reaching even greater heights. Their bulk matches their stature, with most adult males massing between 300 and 400 kilograms of dense muscle and reinforced bone. This tremendous size results directly from adaptation to gravitational forces, often twice or even 3 times Terran standard. On their native worlds, Ogryns move with reasonable agility despite their bulk, but in standard gravity environments they display shocking strength and resilience. Their bones possess density far exceeding baseline human norms, making them extraordinarily difficult to break even under impacts that would shatter normal human skeletons. Multiple redundant organs provide additional survivability, allowing Ogryns to sustain injuries that would kill baseline humans outright and continue fighting. The musculature of an Ogryn represents perhaps the most immediately obvious adaptation to high-gravity conditions. Their muscle fibers show increased density and altered composition, generating force output that dwarfs baseline human capabilities. An average Ogryn can lift and carry loads exceeding half a ton without significant strain. In combat situations, they routinely tear through obstacles that would require heavy equipment for normal troops to breach. Their punches deliver force comparable to industrial machinery, capable of caving in armor plate or pulverizing bone with single strikes. This tremendous physical strength makes them devastating in close-quarters combat, where they can simply overpower most opponents through brute force. The skin of an Ogryn grows thick and tough, providing natural protection against environmental hazards and minor weapons fire. While not impervious to damage, their hide can turn aside glancing blows from bladed weapons and provides measurable resistance to small arms fire. Combined with their dense musculature and redundant organs, this natural armor gives Ogryns remarkable survivability on the battlefield. They routinely survive wounds that would incapacitate or kill normal soldiers, continuing to fight through injuries that would send baseline humans into shock. Imperial Medicae personnel report that treating wounded Ogryns requires techniques more commonly associated with large animal veterinary practice than standard human medicine. The same evolutionary pressures that built the Ogryn physique extracted a heavy price in cognitive capacity. The human brain requires tremendous energy to function, and the metabolic demands of maintaining an Ogryn's massive frame leave limited resources for complex neural development. Most Ogryns display intelligence levels comparable to human children, with correspondingly limited capacity for abstract reasoning, long-term planning, or complex problem-solving. They struggle with written language, advanced mathematics, and any task requiring multiple steps or conditional logic. Their speech tends towards simple sentence structures with limited vocabulary, though they understand spoken commands readily enough if delivered clearly and directly. This cognitive limitation might have rendered Ogryns unsuitable for military service despite their physical advantages, but they possess compensating psychological traits that make them exceptionally valuable soldiers in specific roles. Ogryns display profound loyalty to authority figures they recognize as leaders, following orders with unwavering dedication once they accept someone's command. This loyalty operates on an almost instinctive level, requiring no complex ideological indoctrination or appeals to abstract principles. An Ogryn who bonds with an officer will follow that individual into any danger without hesitation or complaint, motivated by simple trust rather than tactical understanding or personal ambition. Their limited cognitive capacity actually provides certain advantages in military contexts. Ogryns feel fear, but their inability to fully comprehend tactical situations or calculate odds means they rarely panic or break under fire. They lack the imagination to envision all the ways a situation might go wrong, focusing instead on the immediate task their commanders have assigned. This makes them remarkably steady under conditions that might cause more intelligent troops to lose their nerve. Artillery barrages, massed enemy fire, and horrific casualties that would shatter the morale of normal units often fail to impact Ogryn formations significantly, as the Abhumans simply continue executing their orders regardless of circumstances. The Adeptus Munitorum recognized these characteristics early in the Imperium's history and developed specialized Ogryn regiments within the Militarum Auxilia. These formations operate under different organizational structures than standard Imperial Guard regiments, reflecting both the capabilities and limitations of their Abhuman troops. Ogryn units typically feature higher ratios of officers and non-commissioned officers to enlisted personnel, as the Abhumans require more direct supervision than baseline human soldiers. Command staff assigned to Ogryn regiments undergo specialized training in managing Abhuman troops, learning to issue orders in clear, simple language, and to maintain the personal bonds that ensure Ogryn loyalty. Tactical deployment of Ogryn units focuses on roles that maximize their physical advantages while minimizing the impact of their cognitive limitations. They excel as shock troops, smashing into enemy positions with overwhelming force and breaking defensive lines through sheer physical power. Imperial commanders employ them for frontal assaults against fortified positions, where their resilience allows them to advance through fire that would pin down normal infantry. They prove invaluable in urban combat and close-quarters fighting, where their strength and durability dominate over tactical sophistication. Boarding actions, tunnel fighting, and any combat situation requiring troops to physically break through obstacles all favor Ogryn capabilities. Standard Ogryn equipment reflects their role as assault troops while accommodating their physical characteristics and mental limitations. The Ripper gun serves as the most common Ogryn firearm, a massive automatic weapon that fires large caliber rounds with tremendous stopping power. The weapon's design emphasizes simplicity and durability over accuracy or sophistication. Ogryns lack the fine motor control for precision shooting, but the Ripper gun's high rate of fire and powerful ammunition allow them to saturate target areas with devastating effect at close to medium range. The weapons themselves must be built to withstand the tremendous forces Ogryns exert when handling them, as normal rifles would simply break apart in their massive hands. For close combat, Ogryns typically carry huge knives or clubs that would qualify as two-handed weapons for baseline humans, but which the Abhumans wield one-handed with casual ease. These weapons range from simple sharpened metal bars to more elaborate designs incorporating power field technology, depending on the regiment's equipment allocation and the strategic importance of their deployment. Some Ogryn units receive massive chainblades or other specialized close combat weapons, though the Adeptus Munitorum must balance the effectiveness of such equipment against the logistical challenges of producing and maintaining weapons scaled for Ogryn use. The Biochemical Ogryn Neural Enhancement Program, universally known by its acronym BONE, represents the Imperium's most significant attempt to address the cognitive limitations that restrict Ogryn tactical flexibility. Developed by biologist genetors working in conjunction with Imperial military authorities, the BONE procedure involves a complex regimen of biochemical treatments, surgical interventions, and psycho-conditioning designed to enhance Ogryn intelligence and leadership capability. The process begins with careful screening to identify Ogryns displaying above-average cognitive function within their population, as the treatments work best on individuals who already show some capacity for complex thought. The biochemical component of BONE treatment involves sustained administration of compounds that promote neural development and synaptic formation. These drugs push the Ogryn brain toward greater complexity and processing power, though the gains remain modest by baseline human standards. Surgical interventions supplement the chemical treatments, with genetor chirurgeons implanting specialized neural augmetics designed to enhance specific cognitive functions. These implants do not grant true intelligence in the conventional sense, but rather provide structured support for particular mental processes such as tactical assessment, unit coordination, or threat evaluation. Psycho-conditioning forms the third pillar of the BONE program, using intensive training and conditioning techniques to instill more sophisticated behavioral patterns and decision-making processes. BONE Ogryns undergo months or even years of instruction in military leadership, tactical doctrine, and command authority. The training emphasizes practical skills over theoretical knowledge, teaching boneheads, as they are commonly known, to recognize specific tactical situations and respond with appropriate actions rather than attempting to develop true strategic thinking. The process produces Ogryns capable of functioning as squad leaders and junior officers within Abhuman units, providing the local command presence necessary for effective military operations. Success rates for BONE treatment vary considerably depending on the individual Ogryn and the specific facility administering the procedure. The best programs, operating from well-equipped facilities with experienced genetor staff, achieve enhancement in perhaps 1 in 10 candidates. Lesser facilities see far lower success rates, and even successful treatments produce varying degrees of improvement. Some BONE Ogryns gain sufficient cognitive capacity to function as effective squad leaders, issuing tactical orders and adapting to changing battlefield conditions with reasonable competence. Others show only marginal improvement, gaining perhaps slightly better understanding of complex orders, but remaining fundamentally limited in their mental capacity. The physical cost of BONE treatment can be substantial. The biochemical agents used in the process place significant stress on Ogryn physiology, and the surgical procedures carry inherent risks when performed on beings with such massive and unusual anatomy. Some candidates die during treatment, their bodies unable to tolerate the biochemical load or surgical trauma. Others survive the procedure, but suffer permanent side effects ranging from chronic pain to organ damage. The Adeptus Munitorum considers these casualties acceptable given the military value of successfully enhanced Ogryns, but the program's mortality rate ensures it remains limited in scope, rather than becoming standard practice for all Ogryn troops. Bullgryns represent a specialized Ogryn variant that emphasizes their natural durability and transforms them into mobile fortifications. These Abhumans receive extensive augmentation and specialized equipment that turns them into walking shields for Imperial forces. The core of Bullgryn equipment consists of massive slab shields, enormous plates of reinforced metal that would require powered assistance for baseline humans to carry, but which Ogryns manipulate through pure strength. These shields provide mobile cover for advancing troops, allowing entire squads to advance behind Bullgryns who absorb enemy fire that would otherwise devastate more lightly armored infantry. Bullgryn slab shields come in several configurations depending on tactical requirements and available resources. Basic models consist of simple plates of thick metal, effective against small arms fire, and shrapnel, but vulnerable to heavier weapons. More sophisticated versions incorporate layered armor materials, ablative coatings, and even limited energy field generators that enhance their protective capabilities. The largest slab shields stand taller than the Ogryns carrying them, providing cover for multiple soldiers and creating mobile barriers that reshape battlefield dynamics. Imperial commanders employ Bullgryns to break through kill zones, advance across open ground under fire, and establish forward positions in the face of determined enemy resistance. The offensive capability of Bullgryns centers on their grenadier gauntlets, massive powered fists equipped with grenade launchers integrated into their structure. These weapons allow Bullgryns to deliver devastating close-range firepower while maintaining their shield protection. The gauntlets fire a variety of grenade types depending on tactical requirements, from high-explosive rounds for anti-personnel work to crack grenades for engaging armored targets. The powered fist component of the weapon enhances the already tremendous punching power of an Ogryn, allowing Bullgryns to smash through armored vehicles, blast through fortified positions, or pulverize enemy combatants with single blows. Some Bullgryn units instead carry massive mauls known as battle mauls or power mauls, enormous close combat weapons that combine the Ogryn's strength with power field technology. These weapons deliver crushing impacts capable of destroying heavy armor and obliterating infantry formations. Bullgryns wielding mauls sacrifice the ranged capability of grenadier gauntlets, but gain even greater effectiveness in close combat, making them ideal for assault operations, where the fighting inevitably devolves into brutal melee. The sight of Bullgryns advancing behind their shields and wielding these massive weapons has broken enemy morale on countless battlefields, as few troops possess the courage to stand against such overwhelming physical force. Individual Ogryns occasionally achieve recognition that transcends their species' general reputation for simple-minded loyalty. Nork Dedog stands as the most famous example, an Ogryn bodyguard whose service record spans decades and whose exploits have entered Imperial military legend. Nork served as personal bodyguard to multiple officers over his long career, most notably Colonel Grace of the Catachan 3rd Regiment. His devotion to his assigned charges became legendary even among Ogryns, a species already noted for unwavering loyalty. Nork's service record documents dozens of instances where he placed himself between his officer and enemy fire, sustaining wounds that would have killed baseline humans multiple times over while ensuring his charge survived. The relationship between Nork and Colonel Grace exemplified the bond that can develop between Ogryn bodyguards and their officers. Grace treated Nork with respect and genuine affection, recognizing the Ogryn's limitations while valuing his absolute dedication. Nork, in turn, displayed unusual cognitive capacity for an Ogryn, learning to anticipate threats and respond to tactical situations with surprising sophistication. When Colonel Grace fell in battle despite Nork's protection, the Ogryn's grief manifested in a berserker rage that saw him single-handedly destroy the enemy unit responsible before carrying his officer's body from the battlefield. Subsequent assignments saw Nork provide equally devoted service to other officers, his reputation ensuring that commanders considered assignment of Nork Dedog a mark of high honor and trust. The cultural integration of Ogryns within the broader Astra Militarum presents unique challenges that Imperial authorities address through specialized training and careful management of human-to-human interaction. Most Ogryns display what observers describe as childlike devotion to the Emperor, understanding the Imperial faith in simple, concrete terms that emphasize loyalty to authority and protection of humanity. They grasp that the Emperor represents the ultimate authority figure, the greatest leader to whom all lesser leaders ultimately answer. This understanding, while theologically unsophisticated, generates genuine religious devotion that manifests in touching displays of faith. Ogryn religious practice centers on simple rituals and direct expressions of loyalty. They participate enthusiastically in military religious services, though their limited comprehension means they often miss the theological nuances of sermons and liturgy. What they lack in understanding, they compensate for with enthusiasm, singing hymns with tremendous volume if limited pitch accuracy, and offering prayers that emphasize protection of their comrades and victory for the Emperor's forces. Ministorum priests assigned to Ogryn units learn to conduct services that emphasize concrete imagery and simple moral lessons rather than complex theological arguments, finding that Ogryns respond well to direct statements about duty, loyalty, and service. The relationship between baseline human troops and their Ogryn comrades varies considerably depending on regimental culture and individual attitudes. Some Imperial Guard units welcome Ogryns as valued comrades, recognizing their combat effectiveness and appreciating their loyal nature. Soldiers in these regiments develop genuine affection for their Ogryn companions, treating them with the protective care one might show to particularly large and dangerous children. They learn to communicate effectively with the Abhumans, understand their limitations, and appreciate their strengths. Veterans tell stories of Ogryns who saved entire squads through their strength and resilience, building reputations that transcend their species' general cognitive limitations. Other Imperial forces view Ogryns with suspicion or disdain, seeing them as barely human brutes whose presence in the Astra Militarum represents an uncomfortable compromise with purity standards. Soldiers from worlds with strong anti-Abhuman prejudice often struggle to accept Ogryns as legitimate comrades, viewing them as tools to be used rather than fellow warriors deserving respect. Such attitudes can poison unit cohesion and reduce combat effectiveness, as Ogryns respond poorly to mistreatment or obvious contempt. Imperial commanders dealing with such situations must balance the practical need for unit cohesion against deeply held cultural prejudices, a task requiring considerable diplomatic skill and firm authority. Specialized training facilities scattered across the Imperium focus specifically on preparing Ogryns for military service and managing the integration of Abhuman troops into Imperial military structures. Anarch Zeta stands among the most significant of these worlds, hosting extensive facilities dedicated to Ogryn recruitment, training, and enhancement. The planet's infrastructure includes vast barracks complexes scaled for Ogryn physiology, training grounds designed to accommodate their size and strength, and medical facilities equipped to treat their unique biology. Genitor biologist stations on Anarch Zeta conduct bone procedures and other enhancement programs, while Adeptus Munitorum personnel handle the administrative and logistical challenges of managing large Ogryn populations. Training programs on worlds like Anarch Zeta emphasize practical skills over theoretical knowledge, recognizing Ogryn cognitive limitations while developing their natural capabilities. Recruits learn to operate their weapons through repetitive practice until the actions become automatic, requiring no conscious thought. They drill endlessly in basic tactical maneuvers, learning to advance, take cover, and assault positions through muscle memory rather than tactical understanding. Physical conditioning programs push even Ogryn endurance to its limits, ensuring that Abhuman troops arrive at their assigned regiments in peak physical condition and ready for immediate deployment. The Abhuman strain known as Ratlings emerged from human populations stranded on low-gravity agricultural worlds during the Age of Strife, where environmental pressures drove evolutionary changes that produced beings dramatically different from their Ogryn cousins, yet equally divergent from baseline humanity. where high gravity crushed humanity into massive forms, the gentle pull of their adopted homeworlds allowed rattling ancestors to develop along entirely different lines. The typical ratling stands barely over 1 meter tall, with a slight build that makes them appear almost childlike to baseline human observers. This diminutive stature results directly from generations spent in gravitational fields often half or less than Terran standard, where the structural support requirements for upright bipedal locomotion decreased dramatically. The evolutionary pressures of low-gravity agricultural worlds shaped more than just rattling height. Their hands developed exceptional dexterity, with long, nimble fingers capable of manipulating small objects with precision that exceeds baseline human capability. This manual dexterity emerged as an adaptation to the detailed work required in agricultural societies, where crop cultivation, food preparation, and craft production demanded fine motor control. Rattling eyesight similarly shows marked enhancement over human norms, with exceptional visual acuity at distance and superior low-light vision. These ocular adaptations likely developed in response to the need to spot potential threats or game animals across the open agricultural plains that dominated their homeworlds, where predators or hostile wildlife posed constant dangers to farming communities. The metabolic peculiarities of ratlings represent perhaps their most notorious characteristic. Despite their small size, ratlings possess appetites that would seem more appropriate for beings twice their mass. They require frequent meals and display remarkable capacity for food consumption when given opportunity. Imperial biology's researchers attribute this seemingly paradoxical trait to metabolic adaptations necessitated by low-gravity environments, where the human body's energy regulation systems adjusted to different physical demands. The rattling digestive system shows unusual efficiency, extracting maximum nutritional value from consumed food while simultaneously driving constant hunger signals that ensure adequate caloric intake. This obsession with food extends beyond mere biological necessity into the core of rattling culture. Rattling communities organize their social structures around food preparation and consumption, with culinary skill serving as a primary marker of status and achievement. They develop sophisticated cuisines wherever they settle, transforming even the most basic rations into elaborate meals through techniques passed down across generations. A rattling who can prepare exceptional dishes from limited ingredients earns respect and admiration from their peers, while those who show indifference to food quality face social stigma. Imperial forces that include rattling contingents quickly learn that these Abhumans will go to extraordinary lengths to acquire quality ingredients or cooking equipment, often through means that more charitable observers might describe as creative procurement. The rattling reputation for kleptomania represents a constant source of tension between Abhuman and baseline human units within the Astra Militarum. Ratlings display a cultural attitude toward property ownership that differs markedly from Imperial military standards. They view unguarded or loosely secured items as effectively available for appropriation, operating under an informal code that considers taking such objects more a test of the owner's vigilance than actual theft. This perspective creates endless friction with baseline human regiments, whose soldiers regularly discover equipment, rations, or personal items missing after ratlings pass through their areas. The Abhumans show particular interest in food supplies, cooking implements, and small valuable objects that can be easily concealed and transported. Imperial military authorities struggle to address rattling acquisitive behavior through conventional disciplinary measures. Standard punishments prove largely ineffective, as ratlings view getting caught as the real failure rather than the act of taking items itself. Commanders who attempt to crack down harshly on rattling procurement activities often find their efforts counterproductive, as the Abhumans simply become more careful and creative in their methods rather than ceasing the behavior entirely. More experienced officers learn to manage rattling tendencies through a combination of careful supply security, strategic tolerance of minor infractions, and channeling rattling skills toward military objectives where their light fingers and stealth capabilities provide tactical advantages. The comfort-seeking nature of Ratlings further complicates their integration into Imperial military structures designed around baseline human needs and expectations. Ratlings display marked aversion to unnecessary hardship, consistently seeking to improve their living conditions whenever possible. They prove remarkably resourceful at locating or creating comfortable quarters even in austere field conditions, somehow acquiring cushions, blankets, cooking equipment, and other amenities that make their billets substantially more pleasant than those of their human counterparts. This behavior strikes many baseline human soldiers as unmilitary and soft, reinforcing negative stereotypes about Ratling reliability and martial spirit. Yet these same comfort-seeking tendencies drive Ratlings to develop survival skills that prove invaluable in extended campaigns. Their ability to forage for edible plants, hunt small game, and prepare nutritious meals from unpromising ingredients means Ratling units often maintain better health and morale than baseline human forces operating under similar supply constraints. They excel at making temporary camps more livable, improving sanitation, and organizing efficient field kitchens that keep troops fed even when supply lines falter. Imperial commanders who look past the superficial unmilitary appearance of Ratling encampments recognize that these Abhumans possess practical field craft that enhances overall unit effectiveness. The Adeptus Munitorum recognized early that Ratling physical characteristics and behavioral traits made them unsuitable for conventional infantry roles, but ideal for specialized positions within Imperial military structures. Their small size, natural stealth, exceptional eyesight, and steady hands created obvious potential for sniper operations. Ratling regiments within the Militarum Auxilia organize around this specialization, with the vast majority of Ratling military personnel serving as snipers, scouts, or infiltrators. These roles exploit every natural Ratling advantage while minimizing the impact of their physical limitations and cultural peculiarities. As snipers, Ratlings demonstrate capabilities that rival or exceed those of baseline human marksmen. Their enhanced visual acuity allows them to identify targets at extreme ranges and in poor visibility conditions where human snipers struggle. The exceptional manual dexterity that makes them such effective pilferers translates directly into precise trigger control and steady aim. Their small size provides natural advantages in concealment, as Ratlings can hide in positions too cramped for human snipers and present minimal profiles when properly positioned. Perhaps most importantly, Ratlings display patience and stillness that seems at odds with their generally comfort-seeking nature, capable of remaining motionless in sniper hides for extended periods while waiting for targets to present themselves. Standard Ratling sniper equipment centers on long-las rifles, specialized long-range lasguns that sacrifice the rapid-fire capability of standard patterns for enhanced range and accuracy. These weapons suit Ratling physiology better than conventional sniper rifles, as the lasgun's minimal recoil prevents the weapon from overwhelming their slight frames. The long las provide sufficient power to kill human-sized targets at ranges exceeding 1 kilometer in skilled hands, while remaining light enough for Ratlings to carry and deploy without difficulty. Some elite Ratling snipers receive more exotic weapons, including needle rifles or specialized stub rifles, though logistical considerations mean most units rely on long las as their primary armament. Ratling scout operations leverage their natural stealth and small size to gather intelligence in situations where larger human scouts would face detection. They infiltrate enemy positions by squeezing through gaps in defenses, moving silently through terrain that would challenge baseline human scouts, and observing enemy activities from concealed positions that would be impossible for larger beings to occupy. Their light fingers prove useful in scout operations beyond mere theft, as Ratlings can extract documents, disable alarms, or manipulate equipment without leaving obvious traces. Imperial commanders employ Ratling scouts for reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, for gathering tactical intelligence about enemy positions and movements, and for sabotage operations where stealth matters more than raw combat power. The integration of Ratling contingents into larger Imperial Guard formations follows patterns distinct from Ogryn deployment. Where Ogryns typically form separate Abhuman regiments under human command, Ratlings more commonly attach to baseline human units as specialist support elements. A typical Imperial Guard regiment might include one or more Ratling sniper squads assigned to provide long-range fire support and reconnaissance capabilities. These squads operate with considerable autonomy, as their specialized roles require flexibility that rigid command structures would compromise. Ratling squad leaders, usually the most experienced shots or scouts, coordinate with regimental command staff to deploy their troops where sniper support or reconnaissance provides maximum tactical benefit. The cultural friction between Ratlings and baseline human troops manifests differently than human Ogryn tensions. Where Ogryns face prejudice based on their obvious physical and mental differences, Ratlings encounter suspicion rooted in their behavioral characteristics and cultural practices. Human soldiers resent Ratling procurement activities, viewing the Abhumans as thieves who undermine unit cohesion and military discipline. The Ratling focus on comfort and quality food strikes many baseline troops as unmilitary softness inappropriate for warriors of the Imperium. Stories circulate through Imperial forces about Ratlings who abandoned positions to seek better food, who traded military equipment for cooking supplies, or who spent combat downtime preparing elaborate meals while human soldiers endured hardship. Yet combat experience tends to moderate these negative attitudes among troops who actually serve alongside Ratlings. Soldiers who witness Ratling snipers eliminating enemy officers, heavy weapons crews, or other high-value targets from impossible ranges develop appreciation for Abhuman marksmanship. Infantry who benefit from intelligence gathered by Ratling scouts recognize the value these small Abhumans provide to overall mission success. The discovery that Ratlings somehow manage to produce hot, palatable meals from standard rations that human cooks render barely edible wins grudging respect from troops tired of bland or poorly prepared field rations. Veterans learn that while Ratlings may not look or act like proper soldiers, they contribute meaningfully to Imperial military operations in ways that justify their presence. Ratling participation in major Imperial campaigns demonstrates their tactical value across diverse combat environments. During the Sabbat World's Crusade, Ratling contingents attached to numerous regiments provided reconnaissance and sniper support throughout the extended campaign. Their scouts proved particularly valuable in urban combat environments, where their small size allowed infiltration through rubble, sewers, and damaged structures that blocked larger troops. Ratling snipers operating in the ruins of hive cities eliminated enemy commanders and specialists with methodical precision, disrupting enemy command structures and degrading their combat effectiveness. The Abhumans' ability to forage and prepare food in devastated war zones helped sustain Imperial forces when supply lines stretched thin across the Crusade's vast operational area. The Armageddon Wars saw extensive Ratling deployment in reconnaissance roles, where their stealth capabilities proved essential for gathering intelligence about Orc movements and positions. Ratling scouts infiltrated Orc-held territories to observe enemy strength, identify strategic targets, and guide Imperial artillery strikes. Their small size and natural stealth allowed them to approach much closer to Orc positions than human scouts could manage, providing detailed tactical information that shaped Imperial operational planning. Ratling snipers targeted Orc leaders and specialists, with some achieving remarkable kill counts against enemy nobs and mechs whose deaths disrupted greenskin command structures. The harsh conditions of Armageddon tested Ratling resourcefulness, yet the Abhumans maintained better health and morale than many baseline human units through their superior foraging and field craft skills. Individual Ratlings occasionally achieve recognition that elevates them beyond their species' general reputation. While no Ratling has achieved the legendary status of figures like Nork Dedog, various Abhuman snipers and scouts have earned commendations for exceptional service. Imperial military records document Ratling snipers who achieved hundreds of confirmed kills, scouts who provided intelligence that proved decisive in major engagements, and even Ratling soldiers who displayed unexpected courage in situations where their small size and general preference for safety might have suggested retreat. These individuals demonstrate that rattling limitations in conventional military virtues do not preclude genuine heroism when circumstances demand it. The theological status of Ratlings within the Imperial Creed generates less controversy than that of Ogryns, perhaps because their obvious intelligence and relatively minor physical divergence from baseline humanity makes their essential humanity harder to dispute. Ratlings practice the Imperial faith with genuine devotion, though their religious expression emphasizes different aspects than baseline human worship. They show particular reverence for the Emperor as provider and protector, viewing him as the ultimate guarantor of humanity's survival and prosperity. Rattling prayers often focus on thanksgiving for food and safety, requesting the Emperor's blessing on meals and protection during dangerous missions. This emphasis on practical divine providence, rather than abstract theological concepts, reflects Rattling cultural values while remaining doctrinally acceptable to most ecclesiarchy authorities. Ministorum priests assigned to units with Rattling contingents report that the Abhumans participate enthusiastically in religious services, though they sometimes display behavior that more rigid clerics find inappropriate. Rattlings have been observed trading food items during services, discussing recipes in whispered conversations during sermons, or focusing more attention on post-service meals than on liturgical content. Yet they respond with genuine emotion to prayers for the Emperor's protection, show sincere gratitude in thanksgiving services, and display real faith in the Emperor's divine guardianship. Most practical-minded priests conclude that Rattling piety, while culturally distinctive, represents authentic religious devotion worthy of acceptance within the broad diversity of Imperial worship. The squat civilization emerged from human populations that colonized the mineral-rich worlds orbiting the galactic core during humanity's first great expansion into the stars. These colonists established themselves on planets where tremendous gravitational forces and intense radiation from the densely packed stellar neighborhood created environmental conditions unlike anything found in the galaxy's spiral arms. The worlds they settled possessed extraordinary mineral wealth, with heavy elements and rare materials concentrated in quantities that made them irresistible targets for exploitation despite their hostile conditions. Over thousands of years of isolation during the Age of Strife, these human populations adapted to their environments in ways that paralleled Ogryn development, but produced dramatically different results. The high-gravity conditions of core worlds drove squat ancestors toward compact, dense physiology similar to Ogryns, but the squats retained and even enhanced their cognitive capabilities rather than sacrificing intelligence for physical power. The typical squat stood between 1.3 and 1.5 meters tall, with a broad, heavily muscled frame that provided strength disproportionate to their height. Their bones grew exceptionally dense to support their mass under crushing gravity, while their musculature developed the compact efficiency necessary for work in the deep mining operations that formed the foundation of their civilization. Unlike Ogryns, whose adaptation to high gravity came at the cost of mental capacity, squats maintained human-level intelligence and developed sophisticated technological capabilities that rivaled or exceeded Imperial standards in certain specialized fields. The radiation-saturated environment of the galactic core imposed additional selective pressures on squat evolution. Their skin developed natural resistance to radiation exposure that would sicken or kill baseline humans, allowing them to work in conditions that required extensive protective equipment for others. Their cellular repair mechanisms showed enhanced efficiency, limiting the damage from constant low-level radiation exposure that characterized life near the galactic core. These adaptations proved essential for survival in an environment where the normal spacing between stars compressed dramatically, where stellar radiation overlapped and accumulated, and where the background radiation from the galaxy's central black hole permeated everything. Squat civilization organized around the strongholds, massive underground fortress cities carved deep into the bedrock of their homeworlds. These structures combined residential areas, industrial facilities, mining operations, and defensive fortifications into integrated complexes that could house millions of squats in relative safety from their planet's hostile surface conditions. The strongholds represented engineering achievements of staggering scale, with some extending dozens of kilometers into planetary crust and incorporating artificial caverns large enough to contain entire cities. Squat engineers designed these structures to last for millennia, using construction techniques and materials that ensured stability even under extreme seismic stress and gravitational strain. The technological prowess of squat civilization manifested most clearly in their mining and manufacturing capabilities. Squats developed mining equipment and techniques optimized for extracting valuable minerals from deep underground deposits in high-gravity environments. Their drilling machines, ore processors, and transport systems operated at efficiency levels that impressed even Adeptus Mechanicus observers. The mineral wealth they extracted from their worlds fed sophisticated manufacturing industries that produced everything from basic tools to advanced weapons and vehicles. Squat craftsmen took pride in their work, creating items built to exacting standards and designed for longevity rather than disposability. The squats showed particular excellence in the design and construction of war engines and armored vehicles. Their strongholds housed forge complexes where squat engineers built tanks, artillery pieces, and other military equipment, incorporating technologies that drew from standard template construct databases preserved since the dark age of technology. These machines emphasized durability and firepower over speed or elegance, reflecting squat cultural values and their practical experience with warfare in confined underground spaces and on high-gravity worlds. Squat land trains, massive tracked vehicles that served as mobile fortresses and troop transports, demonstrated engineering capabilities that few Imperial forge worlds could match. When the Great Crusade reached the galactic core region, the Imperium encountered squat civilization as a going concern, rather than scattered primitive populations requiring uplifting. The squats had maintained technological sophistication throughout the Age of Strife, preserving knowledge and capabilities that many human worlds had lost. They operated as independent polities organized around their strongholds, with each fortress city functioning as an autonomous state under the leadership of its stronghold lords. These leaders combined political authority with technical expertise, as squat culture valued practical competence and engineering skill as prerequisites for leadership positions. The initial contact between the Imperium and squat civilization proceeded more smoothly than encounters with many other human populations. The squats recognized their common humanity with the Imperium's forces despite their physical differences, while Imperial authorities acknowledged squat technological capabilities and the strategic value of their mineral-rich worlds. Negotiations established a relationship that granted the squats semi-autonomous status within the Imperium, allowing them to maintain their traditional governance structures and cultural practices while acknowledging Imperial sovereignty and contributing to the broader Imperial war effort. This arrangement reflected practical realities on both sides. The squats valued their independence and had the military capability to make conquest of their worlds extremely costly. Their strongholds represented formidable defensive positions that could withstand extended sieges, while their technological expertise meant they could produce weapons and equipment matching Imperial Guard standards. The Imperium, meanwhile, recognized that forcing the squats into full compliance would waste resources better spent on the Crusades' expansion, while potentially destroying the very industrial capacity that made the squat worlds valuable. Semi-autonomous status allowed both parties to benefit from cooperation without the friction that full integration might have generated. The trading partnerships that developed between squat strongholds and the Imperium proved mutually beneficial. The squats exported manufactured goods, refined metals, and specialized equipment to Imperial worlds, receiving in return agricultural products, light manufactured goods, and materials unavailable in the galactic core region. Squat mining equipment found markets throughout the Imperium, valued for its durability and efficiency. Their weapons and armor earned reputations for reliability, with some Imperial Guard regiments specifically requesting squat manufactured equipment when supply allocations permitted. The squats particularly excelled in producing conversion beamers, plasma weapons, and other advanced armaments that required sophisticated manufacturing capabilities. Squat contributions to Imperial military forces took several forms beyond simple equipment sales. Some strongholds raised military contingents that served alongside Imperial Guard regiments during campaigns, bringing squat war engines and technical expertise to battlefields across the galaxy. These squat forces operated under their own command structures while coordinating with Imperial authorities, maintaining the autonomy that characterized their relationship with the broader Imperium. Squat engineers and technicians sometimes accompanied Imperial expeditions as advisors or specialists, providing technical knowledge that proved valuable in mining operations, fortification construction, or equipment maintenance. The Squat Brotherhoods represented the primary military organizations of Squat civilization, combining aspects of professional armies, craft guilds, and extended family networks. Each brotherhood maintained its own traditions, heraldry, and specializations, with some focusing on particular types of warfare or equipment. The brotherhoods recruited from specific strongholds or regions, creating strong bonds between military units and their home communities. Squat warriors took pride in their brotherhood affiliations, viewing military service as an extension of their broader cultural values, emphasizing craftsmanship, reliability, and mutual obligation. The military equipment employed by Squat forces reflected their engineering philosophy and combat doctrine. Squat infantry carried weapons built to withstand the punishment of sustained combat, with bolters, lasguns, and other small arms manufactured to tolerances that ensured function even after abuse that would disable weapons of Imperial manufacture. Their armor combined protection with mobility, designed for warriors who needed to fight in the confined spaces of underground warfare while maintaining enough agility for surface operations. Squat vehicles emphasized heavy armor and powerful weapons over speed, as their combat experience centered on defensive operations and breakthrough assaults rather than mobile warfare. The relationship between Squats and the Adeptus Mechanicus proved complex and sometimes contentious. The tech priests recognized Squat technical competence and valued their preserved STC knowledge, but they viewed Squat independence and unwillingness to fully embrace Mechanicus doctrine with suspicion. Squats maintained their own understanding of technology, rooted in practical engineering rather than religious reverence, treating machines as tools to be understood and improved rather than holy relics to be preserved unchanged. This philosophical difference created friction when Mechanicus representatives attempted to assert authority over Squat manufacturing or demanded access to Squat technical archives. Some Squat strongholds developed productive relationships with nearby Forge worlds, exchanging technical knowledge and collaborating on manufacturing projects. These partnerships benefited both parties, as Squats gained access to Mechanicus resources and expertise, while the tech priests obtained Squat insights into particular technologies or manufacturing processes. Other strongholds maintained careful distance from the Mechanicus, protecting their technical independence while meeting minimum obligations to share certain technologies with Imperial authorities. The diversity of these relationships reflected the decentralized nature of both Squat civilization and the Mechanicus itself, with local conditions and personalities shaping interactions more than any overarching policy. The catastrophic decline of Squat civilization began in the 41st millennium when Tyrannid hive fleets penetrated into the galactic core region. The same dense stellar geography that had shaped Squat evolution now channeled the Tyrannid advance, as the Xenos swarms followed the concentrations of stellar systems and biomass toward the galactic center. The Squats found themselves directly in the path of multiple hive fleet tendrils, facing an enemy unlike any they had previously encountered. The Tyrannids cared nothing for the mineral wealth the Squats had spent millennia extracting, seeking only the biological matter of the Squats themselves, and whatever organic materials existed on their worlds. The initial Tyrannid assaults on Squat worlds revealed the terrible effectiveness of the hive fleets against even well-defended positions. The strongholds that had protected squats from surface dangers and hostile forces for thousands of years proved vulnerable to enemies that could dig through solid rock, infiltrate through the smallest openings, and overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers. Tyrannid bioships deployed organisms specifically adapted for underground warfare, creatures that could navigate tunnel systems, survive in low-oxygen environments, and tear through fortifications that conventional forces could never breach. The squats fought desperately, employing every weapon and defensive measure their engineering expertise could devise, but the Tyrannid swarms kept coming. Orc invasions compounded the disaster facing squat civilization. Greenskin empires in the galactic core region launched their own attacks on squat worlds, drawn by the prospect of good fighting and valuable loot. The orcs cared nothing for the strategic situation or the Tyrannid threat, simply seeing the squats as enemies to be fought and conquered. Some squat strongholds found themselves simultaneously defending against Tyrannid infiltration from below and orc assaults from above, their forces stretched beyond breaking point, trying to hold against enemies attacking from multiple directions. The mineral-rich nature of squat worlds attracted orc mechs who saw opportunities to build ever larger war machines from captured squat equipment and local resources. The Imperium's response to the squat crisis proved inadequate to the scale of the disaster. Imperial forces engaged in their own desperate struggles across the galaxy had limited resources available for relief expeditions to the galactic core. The distances involved made rapid response impossible, as even the fastest warp travel required extended time to reach the core worlds from the Imperium's main concentrations of military power in the Spiral Arms. Some Imperial commanders argued for major relief efforts, recognizing the strategic value of squat industrial capacity and the moral obligation to aid fellow humans, but the Adeptus Munitorum calculated that the resources required for effective intervention exceeded what could be spared from other critical theaters. Squat strongholds fell one by one over the course of decades, their populations consumed by Tyrannids or scattered by orc invasions. Some strongholds managed to evacuate portions of their populations before final defeat, with refugee ships carrying survivors toward Imperial space or other squat worlds not yet under direct attack. These refugees brought tales of desperate last stands, of entire brotherhoods fighting to the last warrior to buy time for civilians to escape, of stronghold lords destroying their own fortress cities rather than letting them fall intact to the enemy. The evacuation effort saved some squats, but the numbers paled compared to the populations lost as stronghold after stronghold went silent. The Administratum's official response to inquiries about the squat homeworlds evolved from promises of relief expeditions to acknowledgement of communication difficulties to eventual admission that contact had been lost. By the late 41st millennium, Imperial authorities generally classified the squat civilization as effectively extinct, with their core worlds either consumed by Tyrannids or occupied by orcs. The loss represented not just the destruction of an Abhuman population, but the elimination of significant industrial capacity and technical knowledge that the Imperium could ill afford to lose. Some Imperial officials viewed the squat extinction as a tragedy, while others quietly considered it a simplification of the Imperium's already overwhelming administrative and military challenges. The revelation of the Leagues of Votann in recent times fundamentally altered understanding of squat survival and civilization. These kin, as they call themselves, represent not scattered refugees from destroyed strongholds, but a thriving civilization that maintained independence from the Imperium throughout its history. The Leagues operate as a stellar empire in their own right, controlling numerous worlds and maintaining technological capabilities that match or exceed Imperial standards in many areas. Their existence demonstrates that squat civilization never faced complete extinction, but rather that a significant portion of the squat population always remained outside Imperial knowledge or contact. The Leagues of Votann organized around powerful artificial intelligences known as Votann, ancient thinking machines that serve as repositories of knowledge and sources of guidance for kin civilization. These AIs date back to the Dark Age of technology, representing some of the few functional artificial intelligences that survived the Age of Strife intact. The kin revere their Votann not as gods, but as ancestors and teachers, sources of wisdom that have guided their civilization for millennia. This relationship with artificial intelligence sets the Leagues apart from both the Imperium's prohibition on thinking machines and the Mechanicus's religious approach to technology. The military forces of the Leagues of Votann demonstrate the advanced technological capabilities the kin maintained throughout their isolation. Their warriors employ weapons and equipment incorporating technologies the Imperium lost or never fully developed, with particular emphasis on durable, reliable designs that reflect their cultural values. Kin combat doctrine emphasizes combined arms operations, with infantry, vehicles, and support elements working in careful coordination. Their forces include specialized units like the Hearthkin Warriors, who form the backbone of League military power, and the Einher Hearthguard, who serve as elite heavy infantry, equipped with the finest weapons and armor Kinforges can produce. The relationship between the Leagues of Votann and the Imperium remains complex and often tense. The Imperium views the Leagues as potential threats, independent human polities that reject imperial authority and maintain technologies that violate prohibitions against artificial intelligence. The kin, for their part, see the Imperium as a declining empire whose rigid doctrines and inefficient governance represent everything their own civilization sought to avoid. Trade and limited cooperation occur where mutual benefit exists, but the fundamental incompatibility between imperial ideology and League independence prevents anything approaching alliance. Both sides recognize that open conflict would prove costly and pointless, leading to an uneasy coexistence punctuated by occasional clashes over resources or territory. The Beastmen represent perhaps the most tragic and controversial of all recognized Abhuman strains, their history marked by cycles of acceptance and persecution that reflect the Imperium's deepest anxieties about genetic purity and chaos corruption. Unlike Ogryns or Ratlings, whose divergence from baseline humanity followed clear environmental adaptation patterns, Beastmen emerged through processes that remain poorly understood even by genitor biologist specialists. Their origins trace back to the Age of Strife, when warp storms saturated real space with psychic energy and human populations, isolated on thousands of worlds, faced not just environmental pressures, but the mutagenic influence of the Imperium itself. The exact mechanisms that produced Beastmen populations remain subjects of intense scholarly debate within the Adeptus Terra. Some genitor researchers argue that Beastmen represent the results of genetic instability triggered by warp exposure, where the barrier between materium and immaterium grew thin enough to allow chaotic energies to directly influence human genetic expression. Others contend that Beastmen descended from populations that resorted to extreme genetic manipulation during Old Night, attempting to engineer survival traits by incorporating animal DNA into human genomes through Dark Age biotechnology. A third theory suggests that certain human populations exposed to specific combinations of environmental factors and warp influence underwent mutation patterns that coincidentally produced animal-like characteristics without direct chaos intervention. Whatever their ultimate origin, Beastmen manifest a bewildering variety of animal hybrid phenotypes that share certain common characteristics while differing dramatically in specific details. The most prevalent Beastmen strain displays caprid features, with individuals bearing goat-like heads, horns of varying sizes and configurations, cloven hooves instead of feet, and bodies covered in coarse hair. These goat-headed Beastmen appear across numerous worlds throughout the Imperium, their widespread distribution suggesting either multiple independent origins or descent from a common ancestral population that spread during humanity's first expansion into the stars. Their facial structure combines human and caprine elements in unsettling ways, with elongated skulls, horizontal pupilled eyes, and pronounced muzzles that retain enough human characteristics to mark them as Abhuman rather than simple animals. Bovid Beastmen represent another common variant, displaying cattle-like features including broad, flat faces, curved horns, and heavily muscled frames. These individuals typically stand taller and more massively built than pitied types, their physical strength approaching Ogryn levels in some cases, though without the extreme size that characterizes those of humans. Their hands retain human configuration with opposable thumbs, allowing tool use and weapon manipulation despite their otherwise bestial appearance. The bovid beastmen often develop thick, tough hides that provide natural protection against environmental hazards and minor injuries, an adaptation that makes them valued for heavy labor in harsh conditions. Less common beastmen strains display characteristics derived from other animal species. Some populations show canid features with dog or wolf-like heads, enhanced senses of smell and hearing, and digitigrade leg structures. Others manifest feline traits, including cat-like faces, retractable claws, and exceptional reflexes. Avian beastmen appear rarely, bearing bird-like features and occasionally vestigial wing structures that serve no functional purpose but mark them as distinct from other strains. The sheer variety of beastmen phenotypes suggests that whatever process created them operated across many worlds and potentially involved multiple causative factors rather than a single mechanism. The cognitive capabilities of beastmen fall somewhere between baseline humans and Ogryns, varying considerably between individuals and strains. Most beastmen display intelligence sufficient for complex tool use, language comprehension, and social organization, though they rarely match baseline human cognitive performance. They understand abstract concepts well enough to grasp military tactics, follow complex orders, and engage in planning beyond immediate survival needs. Their speech often carries guttural or bleating qualities that reflect their altered vocal structures, but they communicate effectively in Low Gothic and can learn specialized military terminology. Some beastmen show cognitive abilities approaching human norms, while others function at levels barely superior to Ogryns, creating significant variation within beastmen populations. During the Great Crusade and the early Imperium, beastmen enjoyed a degree of acceptance that would become unthinkable in later millennia. Imperial military forces incorporated beastmen auxiliaries into their ranks, recognizing that these Abhumans could serve the Emperor's wars despite their unsettling appearance. The practical demands of the Great Crusade meant that any population capable of holding a lasgun and following orders had potential military value, and beastmen met those minimum standards. They served in auxiliary regiments attached to Imperial army formations, providing additional manpower for garrison duties, labor battalions, and sometimes front-line combat operations, where their physical resilience and bestial ferocity proved useful. The Imperium's early tolerance for beastmen reflected the pragmatic attitudes that characterized the Great Crusade's expansion phase. The Emperor's forces encountered countless variant human populations as they reunited scattered humanity, and the initial response focused on determining which groups could contribute to the Imperium rather than enforcing strict purity standards. Beastmen populations that demonstrated loyalty and military utility received provisional acceptance, with their obvious mutations overlooked in favor of their practical value. Imperial commanders who might personally find beastmen repulsive nonetheless employed them when circumstances demanded additional troops or when beastmen units offered capabilities that baseline human forces lacked. This period of relative acceptance proved short-lived, as the Imperium consolidated its control over reconquered territories and the immediate pressures of the Great Crusade eased. Attitudes toward beastmen began to shift. The Horus heresy and the revelation of chaos corruption within the Imperium's highest ranks triggered waves of paranoia and purges aimed at rooting out potential traitors and corrupted elements. Beastmen, with their mutations and bestial appearance, became targets of suspicion. Their physical characteristics resembled the corrupted forms that chaos worshippers sometimes developed, creating associations between beastmen and chaos taint that proved impossible to dispel regardless of individual beastmen loyalty or service records. The Adeptus Ministorum played a central role in turning imperial opinion against beastmen. Ecclesiarchy preachers pointed to beastmen mutations as evidence of spiritual corruption, arguing that their animal characteristics represented physical manifestations of inner impurity. The theological argument held that the emperor had created humanity in a specific form, and that significant deviations from that form indicated corruption of both body and soul. Beastmen, with their obvious animal features, provided clear examples of such deviation. The fact that many chaos cultists and followers of the ruinous powers developed similar bestial mutations strengthened the association between beastmen and chaos, making it easy for preachers to condemn all beastmen as potentially corrupted regardless of their actual loyalties or actions. The gradual persecution of beastmen unfolded over centuries as imperial authorities systematically withdrew recognition and legal protections. The Adeptus Terra removed beastmen from official lists of sanctioned Abhuman strains, reclassifying them as mutants of questionable loyalty and dubious value. Military formations that had incorporated beastmen auxiliaries received orders to disband these units and discharge their Abhuman troops. Planetary governors who had employed beastmen in labor gangs or local defense forces faced pressure to eliminate these populations, or at minimum segregate them from baseline human communities. The process occurred unevenly across the Imperium's vast territories, with some regions maintaining beastmen populations long after others had purged them, but the overall trend moved inexorably toward exclusion and persecution. Beastmen responded to their changing status by retreating to the margins of Imperial society. On hive worlds, they descended into the underhives, those lawless lower levels where Imperial authority barely penetrated and where outcasts of all types gathered. The underhive environment suited beastmen in some ways, as their physical resilience helped them survive conditions that killed weaker beings, and their bestial appearance made them less conspicuous among the mutants and criminals who populated these zones. Beastmen gangs established territories in the deepest levels, competing with other outcast groups for resources and survival. Some underhive beastmen maintained loose organization and even attempted to preserve military discipline learned during their service in Imperial forces, while others devolved into feral bands that survived through violence and predation. Feral worlds and frontier planets hosted other beastmen populations, where these Abhumans could survive beyond the reach of Imperial persecution. On worlds where human presence remained limited, and where vast wildernesses offered refuge, beastmen established isolated communities that avoided contact with baseline human settlements. These populations reverted to primitive lifestyles, hunting and gathering or practicing basic agriculture, while maintaining enough tool use and social organization to distinguish them from simple animals. Imperial authorities on such worlds typically tolerated beastmen presence, as long as the Abhumans stayed away from human settlements and caused no trouble, though periodic purges occurred when zealous ecclesiarchy officials or particularly rigid governors decided to eliminate these populations. The discrimination beastmen faced manifested in countless daily humiliations and dangers beyond official persecution. Baseline humans viewed them with revulsion and fear, refusing to work alongside them or live in proximity to beastmen communities. Merchants refused to trade with beastmen or charged exploitative prices for basic goods. Imperial authorities denied beastmen access to medical care, education, or legal protections that baseline citizens took for granted. Vigilante groups sometimes attacked beastmen settlements, killing or driving away the inhabitants, while local authorities looked the other way or actively supported the violence. The cumulative effect of this discrimination forced beastmen into increasingly desperate circumstances, where survival required constant vigilance and where any interaction with baseline human society carried risks. The most damning aspect of beastmen persecution stemmed from their documented susceptibility to chaos corruption. Imperial records showed undeniable patterns of beastmen populations falling to chaos worship at rates far exceeding baseline human communities. Whether this vulnerability resulted from their mutated nature, from the warp-tainted origins of their strain, or from the desperate circumstances persecution forced upon them remained unclear, but the statistical reality provided powerful justification for continued persecution. Inquisitorial investigations repeatedly uncovered chaos cults among beastmen populations, finding evidence of demonic worship and heretical practices that confirmed the worst suspicions of Beastmen critics. The ruinous powers, particularly Khorne and Slaanesh, found fertile recruiting ground among outcast Beastmen populations. The Blood God valued the savage ferocity that came naturally to Beastmen, their bestial rage and physical strength making them effective warriors in Chaos warbands. Khornate Beastmen formed significant portions of many Chaos raiding forces, their horns and animal features fitting perfectly with the aesthetic of Khorne worship, while their combat capabilities made them valuable shock troops. They participated in raids against Imperial worlds, slaughtering baseline humans with particular enthusiasm born from generations of persecution and resentment. Slaanesh attracted different Beastmen populations through promises of acceptance and indulgence. The Prince of Pleasure offered Beastmen freedom from the shame and discrimination they faced in Imperial society, encouraging them to embrace their bestial nature and pursue sensation without restraint. Slaaneshi Beastmen often underwent further mutations that enhanced their already animal-like appearance, developing additional limbs, sensory organs, or other alterations that would have horrified them before their corruption, but which they now wore as marks of their god's favor. These corrupted Beastmen participated in the depraved rituals and raids characteristic of Slaanesh worship, their presence in Chaos forces confirming Imperial prejudices about Beastmen corruption. Nurgle and Tzeentch claimed fewer Beastmen followers, though both Chaos gods maintained some presence among outcast Abhuman populations. The Plague God offered Beastmen resilience and freedom from suffering, appealing to populations ground down by disease and hardship in Underhive slums or feral world settlements. Tzeentch attracted those Beastmen who possessed psychic sensitivity or who sought transformation and change, promising them evolution beyond their current degraded state. The variety of Chaos allegiances among corrupted Beastmen demonstrated that all four ruinous powers found these Abhumans useful for their purposes, further cementing Imperial conviction that Beastmen represented inherently corrupted stock. The self-fulfilling nature of Beastmen persecution and corruption remained invisible to most Imperial authorities. Beastmen driven to desperation by discrimination and violence naturally proved more susceptible to Chaos promises of power and revenge. Populations denied legal protections or legitimate means of survival turned to criminal activities that brought them into contact with Chaos cults operating in the same marginal spaces. The very persecution meant to protect the Imperium from corrupted Beastmen instead created conditions that pushed these Abhumans toward Chaos, generating the corruption that justified continued persecution. Breaking this cycle would require acknowledging Beastmen as salvageable members of humanity deserving protection rather than extermination, a position few Imperial authorities found acceptable given the documented cases of Beastmen corruption. Some scattered Imperial worlds maintained different approaches to their Beastmen populations, demonstrating that alternatives to persecution existed even if they remained rare. Certain frontier governors employed Beastmen in labor gangs or local defense forces, finding them useful for tasks that baseline humans refused or proved unsuitable to perform. These populations lived under heavy restrictions and constant supervision, but they received basic protections and opportunities to contribute to their world's economies. The Beastmen in these situations generally showed lower rates of Chaos corruption than their persecuted cousins, suggesting that integration and oversight proved more effective than exclusion and violence, but such examples remained too few and too isolated to influence broader Imperial policy. The current status of Beastmen in the 41st millennium reflects millennia of accumulated persecution and marginalization. They exist as outcasts throughout the Imperium, surviving in underhives on feral worlds and in other spaces where Imperial authority proves too weak or disinterested to eliminate them. Their populations face constant attrition from purges, gang violence, disease, and the harsh conditions of their marginal existence. Those who fall to Chaos find temporary power and purpose serving the ruinous powers, though this path leads inevitably to damnation. The few Beastmen who maintain loyalty to the Imperium, despite everything, face lives of constant danger and discrimination, their service and faith earning them nothing but continued suspicion from the Imperium they refused to abandon. The Felinids of Carlos McConnell represent one of the Imperium's most enigmatic Abhuman strains, their origins and current status obscured by conflicting records and limited documentation. The world itself appears in Imperial archives under multiple designations, with Carlos McConnell and Ulthar both referring to the same planet, though which name holds official status remains unclear due to typical administratum record-keeping inconsistencies. The planet orbits a star in the segmentum Ultima, far enough from major Imperial centers that detailed information about its Abhuman population reaches Terra only sporadically and often contradicts previous reports. Felinids display obvious feline characteristics that distinguish them immediately from baseline humanity. Their faces show subtle but unmistakable cat-like features, with slightly flattened noses, larger eyes positioned for enhanced binocular vision, and ears that taper to points at their tips. Their pupils contract to vertical slits in bright light, a trait that accompanies exceptional night vision capabilities far exceeding baseline human norms. This enhanced low-light vision allows Felinids to operate effectively in darkness that would leave normal humans effectively blind, making them potentially valuable for night operations or combat in poorly lit environments like ship corridors or underhive zones. The physical capabilities of Felinids extend beyond their enhanced vision. They possess reflexes and agility that surpass baseline human performance, moving with fluid grace that observers describe as distinctly cat-like. Their muscle fiber composition shows adaptations that favor quick twitch responses over sustained strength, allowing rapid acceleration and precise control of movement, but limiting their endurance compared to baseline humans. Felinid hands retain fully human configuration with opposable thumbs and normal manual dexterity, though their fingernails grow thicker and harder than human norms, requiring regular trimming to prevent them from developing into claw-like structures that would interfere with fine motor tasks. The skeletal structure of Felinids shows modifications that enhance their flexibility and balance. Their spines display increased articulation, allowing them to twist and bend through angles that would strain or injure baseline human backs. This flexibility combines with an unusually refined sense of balance, making Felinids naturally skilled at climbing, navigating unstable terrain, and maintaining equilibrium in situations where normal humans would stumble or fall. These characteristics suggest evolutionary adaptation to environments requiring three-dimensional movement and precise physical control, though the specific conditions on Carlos McConnell that drove such adaptations remain poorly documented in available Imperial records. Behavioral traits accompanying Felinid physical characteristics prove more difficult to verify through reliable sources. Some reports describe Felinids as possessing predatory instincts that manifest in their approach to combat and hunting, with enhanced focus on moving targets and natural inclination toward stalking behavior. Other accounts mention heightened territorial awareness and strong reactions to perceived intrusions into personal space. The reliability of these behavioral descriptions remains questionable, as many reports about Felinids come from sources with limited direct contact with the population and may reflect stereotypes based on their feline appearance rather than actual observed traits. The integration of Felinids into Imperial military forces occurs on a limited scale that pales compared to the widespread deployment of Ogryns or Ratlings. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains no dedicated Felinid regiments, and these Abhumans appear in Imperial Guard formations only as individual recruits or small groups attached to baseline human units. This limited military presence stems partly from the small size of the Felinid population, as Carlos McConnell apparently supports only modest numbers of these Abhumans compared to the billions of Ogryns or the millions of Ratlings scattered across Imperial space. The planet's distance from major recruitment centers and its limited strategic importance mean that Munitorum officials rarely prioritize drawing troops from its population. The specific military roles Felinids fill when they do serve in Imperial forces remain poorly documented. Their enhanced night vision and agility suggest obvious applications in reconnaissance, infiltration, and night operations, but few verified accounts exist of Felonid units operating in these capacities. Some sources mention Felonid soldiers serving in standard infantry roles within mixed-species regiments, where their physical capabilities provide modest advantages, but do not fundamentally alter their tactical employment. The absence of specialized Felonid formations, or well-documented combat deployments, suggests that whatever advantages these Abhumans offer fail to justify the logistical complications of recruiting and deploying them in significant numbers. The Longshanks of Tellarus emerged from human populations adapted to extremely low-gravity environments over thousands of generations of isolation. Tellarus itself orbits as a moon or small planetary body with gravitational force estimated at perhaps 1/5 Terran standard, though exact measurements appear inconsistently in Imperial records. The human colonists who settled this world during the Dark Age of technology faced an environment where the normal structural requirements for supporting human body mass effectively disappeared, allowing evolutionary pressures to reshape their descendants in dramatic ways that paralleled Ratling development, but produced even more extreme results. The most immediately obvious characteristic of Longshanks lies in their extraordinary height, with adult specimens regularly exceeding 2.5 meters and some individuals reaching 3 meters or more. This extreme stature results from skeletal elongation rather than proportional scaling of baseline human dimensions. Longshank bones grow thin and elongated, particularly in their limbs, creating an appearance that baseline humans often describe as disturbingly stretched or unnaturally extended. Their legs account for much of their height, with femurs and tibias that seem impossibly long and slender to observers accustomed to the proportions necessary for functioning under standard gravity. The skeletal structure of Longshanks shows extensive adaptation to low-gravity conditions. Their bones possess much lower density than baseline human skeletons, reducing mass while maintaining sufficient strength for their native environment. The reduction in bone density extends throughout their skeleton, making Longshanks extremely vulnerable to fractures under standard gravity conditions. A Longshank attempting to function on a Terran standard world would face constant risk of broken bones from impacts or stresses that baseline humans would barely notice. Even their own muscle contractions could potentially fracture their delicate bones if they attempted movements requiring significant force under higher gravity than they evolved for. The musculature of Longshanks reflects their low-gravity origins through reduced mass and altered fiber composition. They possess sufficient strength to move their elongated frames effectively in their native environment, but lack the muscle mass necessary for functioning under standard gravity. Their cardiovascular systems similarly show adaptations to low-gravity conditions, with hearts that pump less forcefully and blood vessels configured for moving fluids against minimal gravitational resistance. These adaptations make Longshanks poorly suited for service on standard gravity worlds, where their weak muscles, fragile bones, and inadequate cardiovascular function would render them effectively helpless. The Imperium employs Longshanks specifically in void operations and low-gravity environments, where their adaptations become advantages rather than crippling disadvantages. Aboard ships, orbital stations, and other installations where artificial gravity remains minimal or absent, Longshanks move with grace and efficiency that baseline humans cannot match. Their elongated limbs allow them to reach across wider spaces and manipulate objects at greater distances, while their natural comfort in low-gravity conditions means they suffer none of the disorientation or nausea that often afflicts baseline humans in such environments. Their reduced mass means they require less force to accelerate or change direction, making them naturally suited for three-dimensional movement in microgravity. Imperial Navy vessels sometimes employ Longshank crew members in specialized roles aboard ships where they work in low-gravity sections or perform maintenance, tasks in areas where standard gravity proves impractical to maintain. Their ability to navigate effectively in these conditions makes them valuable for inspecting and repairing external hull sections, working in cramped access spaces where their slim builds allow passage, and performing tasks in cargo holds or other large volumes where artificial gravity would waste energy. The Navy maintains recruitment arrangements with Tellarus and potentially other low-gravity worlds, drawing small numbers of Longshanks into service, where their unique capabilities justify the complications of accommodating their needs. Military applications of Longshank capabilities focus on boarding actions and combat in low-gravity environments. When Imperial forces assault enemy vessels or orbital installations, Longshanks can operate effectively in conditions that severely disadvantage baseline human troops. They move naturally in microgravity combat, using their elongated limbs to brace against surfaces and control their movement while engaging enemies who struggle with the disorienting environment. Their reach advantage allows them to engage opponents from greater distances in close quarters fighting, and their comfort in three-dimensional movement lets them utilize tactical positions that baseline humans would find difficult to achieve or maintain. The limitations of Longshanks prove as significant as their advantages. Their extreme specialization for low-gravity environments means they cannot deploy to standard gravity worlds without extensive support equipment. Special harnesses and exoskeletal frames can provide structural support that allows Longshanks to function under higher gravity, but such equipment proves cumbersome and expensive to produce and maintain. The Adeptus Munitorum generally considers the cost of supporting Longshank troops in standard gravity operations unjustifiable given their limited numbers and the availability of baseline human forces that require no special accommodation. Consequently, Longshanks serve almost exclusively in void operations and low-gravity combat zones, where their natural capabilities provide clear advantages. The Pelagers represent human adaptations to aquatic environments, though this classification encompasses multiple distinct populations rather than a single unified strain. Human colonies established on ocean worlds during the Dark Age of technology faced environments where water covered most or all planetary surfaces, and where survival required adaptation to aquatic or amphibious existence. Different worlds produced different adaptive responses, resulting in Pelager populations that share general aquatic characteristics while differing significantly in specific features and capabilities. The term Pelager functions more as a categorical designation for aquatic Abhumans than as a name for a single coherent Abhuman strain. Common features among Pelager populations include enhanced swimming capabilities through various physical adaptations. Some Pelager strains developed webbed hands and feet, with skin membranes connecting their fingers and toes to provide improved propulsion through water. Others show more extensive modifications, including streamlined body profiles, reduced body hair, and altered fat distribution that provides insulation in cold water while improving hydrodynamic efficiency. Many Pelagers possess enhanced lung capacity and altered respiratory systems that allow them to hold their breath for extended periods, with some strains capable of remaining submerged for tens of minutes or even hours through metabolic adaptations that reduce oxygen consumption. The most extensively modified Pelager strains show gill-like structures that supplement their lung-based respiration, allowing them to extract oxygen directly from water for limited periods. These organs do not provide true aquatic respiration comparable to fish gills, as Pelagers retain fundamentally human respiratory systems, but they extend underwater endurance significantly beyond baseline human capabilities. The exact function of these structures varies between Pelager populations, with some providing genuine, if limited, oxygen extraction, while others serve primarily to extend breath-holding duration through more efficient gas exchange. Gen-Editor researchers debate whether these adaptations emerged through natural evolution or resulted from Dark Age genetic engineering, with evidence supporting both possibilities depending on which Pelager population receives examination. The Imperium employs Pelagers in specialized roles related to aquatic operations and water world environments. Imperial Navy vessels operating on ocean worlds sometimes recruit local Pelager populations for underwater reconnaissance, salvage operations, and combat diving missions that would require extensive equipment and training for baseline human personnel. Pelagers can inspect submerged portions of ships or installations, retrieve objects from underwater locations, and navigate aquatic environments with natural ease that makes them valuable for operations where water presents significant obstacles to baseline human forces. Their capabilities prove particularly useful on worlds where human settlements exist on floating platforms or coastal areas, requiring constant interaction with aquatic environments. Industrial applications of Pelager capabilities extend to underwater mining operations, aquaculture facilities, and oceanic resource extraction. Some ocean worlds host extensive underwater industrial complexes where Pelagers work in conditions that would require baseline humans to use diving suits, submarines, or other expensive equipment. These Abhumans maintain and operate underwater machinery, harvest aquatic resources, and perform construction or repair work in submerged facilities. Their natural aquatic capabilities reduce operational costs and improve efficiency compared to employing baseline human workers who require constant life support and can work underwater only for limited periods. Military deployment of Pelagers remains limited despite their specialized capabilities. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains no dedicated Pelager regiments, as the specific environments where these Abhumans provide advantages occur too infrequently to justify specialized formations. When Imperial forces conduct operations on ocean worlds or require underwater combat capabilities, local Pelager populations may receive temporary recruitment or conscription to support specific missions. These ad hoc formations dissolve after completing their immediate objectives, with Pelager troops returning to their normal occupations rather than continuing in permanent military service. The limited scope of Pelager military employment reflects the Imperium's general approach to highly specialized Abhuman strains, where recruitment occurs only when specific circumstances make their unique capabilities necessary. The Imperium's vast territories encompass numerous other Abhuman strains that exist in small populations, remain poorly documented, or await official classification by the Adeptus Terra. The Troths represent one such population, mentioned occasionally in Imperial records but never extensively studied or formally recognized. Available information suggests Troths display unusual physical characteristics that distinguish them from baseline humanity, though the specific nature of these differences remains unclear from fragmentary records. Some sources describe them as possessing unusual strength or resilience, while others mention distinctive facial features or body proportions. The lack of consistent documentation prevents any definitive description of Troth characteristics or capabilities. Neandors constitute another obscure Abhuman strain known primarily through scattered references in Administratum archives. The name suggests possible connection to ancient human subspecies that existed on Terra before the rise of modern humanity, though whether Neandors actually represent a reemergence of Neanderthal characteristics or simply received that designation due to superficial similarities remains unknown. Imperial records provide no detailed physical descriptions or information about Neandor populations, their locations, or their relationship with the broader Imperium. They exist as a name in databases, a population acknowledged to exist somewhere in Imperial space, but never studied sufficiently to warrant detailed documentation or official recognition. The classification process for new or poorly documented Abhuman strains proceeds with glacial slowness through the Administratum's bureaucratic machinery. When Imperial forces encounter a potential Abhuman population, local authorities compile reports documenting physical characteristics, genetic samples, breeding patterns, and any relevant historical information. These reports travel through multiple levels of bureaucracy, with each administrative tier reviewing the documentation and adding their own observations or recommendations. The process can consume decades or centuries as reports move from planetary governors to subsector authorities to sector command and eventually to the Adeptus Terra on Terra itself. The criteria for official Abhuman recognition remain consistent with those established during the Great Crusade, emphasizing genetic stability and practical utility to Imperial operations. A population must demonstrate that it breeds true across generations, producing offspring that consistently display the same characteristics as their parents without high mutation rates or genetic instability. The strain must show clear adaptive advantages or capabilities that make them valuable to the Imperium, whether through military service, specialized labor, or survival in environments hostile to baseline humans. Populations failing to meet these criteria face classification as unstable mutant stocks, regardless of their loyalty or willingness to serve, with all the persecution and potential extermination such classification entails. The sheer scale of the Imperium ensures that countless Abhuman populations exist in obscurity, their presence known only to local authorities or not documented at all in official records. Isolated worlds hosting small Abhuman communities may never report their existence to higher Imperial authorities, either through oversight or deliberate concealment. Frontier regions and recently reconquered territories often contain Abhuman strains that predate current Imperial control, populations that survived the Age of Strife and subsequent millennia without contact with the broader Imperium. Some of these populations may possess unique adaptations or capabilities that would interest Imperial authorities if their existence became known, but the vast distances and limited administrative capacity of the Imperium mean many Abhumans live and die without ever appearing in official records. The diversity of human adaptation across the Imperium's million worlds demonstrates the remarkable plasticity of the human genome under varying environmental pressures. Each Abhuman strain represents a distinct solution to specific survival challenges, whether environmental extremes, hostile native life, or the mutagenic influence of warp exposure. The Imperium's approach to this diversity reflects its fundamental tension between the practical need for every available resource in its endless wars and the ideological commitment to human purity that views genetic deviation as inherently suspect. This tension produces the inconsistent policies and varying local practices that characterize Imperial treatment of Abhumans, where acceptance and persecution exist simultaneously across different regions and circumstances. The populations designated as Nightsiders emerged from human colonies stranded on worlds where natural light became scarce or entirely absent during the Age of Strife. These worlds fell into several distinct categories, each producing similar adaptive responses despite their different underlying causes for darkness. Tidally locked planets orbiting close to their stars maintained permanent dark hemispheres where human settlements existed in eternal night, lit only by the faint glow of their stars' corona during rare atmospheric conditions, or by artificial illumination that colonists struggled to maintain as their technology degraded. Other Nightsider populations developed on worlds orbiting dim red dwarf stars that provided insufficient light for baseline human vision, where the sun hung in the sky as little more than a bright point offering warmth but minimal illumination. The most extreme Nightsider populations inhabited worlds deep within dense nebulae or molecular clouds, where interstellar dust blocked starlight so effectively that their skies remained pitch black regardless of stellar proximity. These colonists found themselves in environments where darkness proved absolute outside their failing artificial light sources, where generations grew up never seeing natural daylight, and where the human eye adapted to function in conditions that would leave baseline humans effectively blind. Some Nightsider strains developed on underground colony worlds, where human populations retreated into vast subterranean complexes to escape hostile surface conditions, spending millennia in tunnels and caverns, lit only by whatever power sources they could maintain or by bioluminescent organisms they cultivated for illumination. The physical adaptations characterizing Nightsider populations followed predictable patterns driven by their lightless environments. Their eyes underwent the most dramatic changes, with pupils dilating to sizes that would appear grotesquely large to baseline human observers. The iris muscles controlling pupil size developed enhanced flexibility, allowing extreme dilation in darkness while retaining the ability to contract rapidly when exposed to bright light. The retinas of Nightsider eyes showed increased density of rod cells, those photoreceptors specialized for low-light vision, at the expense of cone cells responsible for color perception and visual acuity in bright conditions. This adaptation granted Nightsiders exceptional night vision capabilities that allowed them to navigate and function in near-total darkness, though it came at the cost of reduced color vision and painful sensitivity to bright light. The tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer behind the retina that exists in many nocturnal animals but not in baseline humans, appeared in many Nightsider strains through either evolutionary development or reactivation of dormant genetic sequences. This structure reflected light back through the retina, effectively giving photoreceptors a second chance to capture photons and dramatically improving vision in low-light conditions. The presence of a tapetum lucidum produced the characteristic eyeshine effect, where Nightsider eyes glowed when illuminated by even minimal light sources, reflecting back an eerie luminescence that many baseline humans found deeply unsettling. The color of this eyeshine varied between Nightsider populations, ranging from pale green to golden yellow to deep red, depending on the specific structure and composition of their tapetum lucidum. Nightsider skin underwent equally dramatic adaptation to their lightless environments. Melanin production, the process that darkens human skin in response to ultraviolet exposure, essentially ceased in populations that experienced no natural sunlight for thousands of generations. Nightsiders developed complexions of extraordinary pallor, with skin that appeared almost translucent in bright light, revealing the network of blood vessels beneath. This extreme paleness served no adaptive purpose, but emerged as the inevitable result of removing all selective pressure for melanin production. The loss of skin pigmentation made Nightsiders acutely vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation, as their unpigmented skin lacked the natural protection that melanin provided against solar damage. The photosensitivity afflicting Nightsider populations extended beyond mere discomfort into genuine medical danger when they encountered standard lighting conditions. Exposure to bright light caused immediate pain as their oversized pupils struggled to contract quickly enough to protect their sensitive retinas. Prolonged exposure to sunlight or intense artificial illumination could cause temporary or even permanent vision damage, with Nightsiders experiencing effects ranging from painful light blindness to actual retinal burns from light levels that baseline humans would consider merely bright but not dangerous. Their unpigmented skin burned rapidly under ultraviolet exposure, developing painful sunburns within minutes of exposure to unfiltered sunlight that would take hours to affect baseline human skin. The practical implications of these adaptations meant that Nightsiders required extensive accommodation to function in standard Imperial environments. They wore protective eyewear incorporating heavy tinting or adaptive filters that reduced incoming light to levels their eyes could tolerate. Some Nightsider populations developed elaborate goggles or visors that covered their eyes completely, using electronic light amplification to provide vision while protecting their sensitive retinas from dangerous illumination levels. Their clothing emphasized full body coverage to protect their vulnerable skin from light exposure, with many Nightsiders adopting hooded robes or environment suits that left no skin exposed to potential ultraviolet radiation. The Adeptus Terra's classification of Nightsiders as true Abhumans rather than simple phenotypic variants sparked considerable debate among genitor biologists researchers. The physical changes characterizing Nightsider populations resulted from straightforward environmental adaptation following well-understood evolutionary principles. No mysterious mechanisms or warp influence drove their development, merely the predictable response of human genetics to environments lacking natural light. Some genetors argued that this made Nightsiders fundamentally different from strains like Ogryns or Ratlings, whose adaptations involved more extensive genetic restructuring. These researchers contended that Nightsiders represented extreme examples of normal human variation rather than true genetic divergence warranting Abhuman classification. The counterargument emphasized that Nightsider adaptations, while mechanistically straightforward, produced permanent genetic changes that bred true across generations and could not be reversed through simple environmental modification. A Nightsider born and raised in standard lighting conditions would still possess the oversized eyes, extreme photosensitivity, and pale complexion of their parents, demonstrating that their characteristics resulted from fixed genetic alterations rather than developmental plasticity. The stability of Nightsider traits across generations and their inability to interbreed successfully with baseline humans without producing offspring showing intermediate characteristics suggested genuine genetic divergence despite the mundane mechanisms underlying their development. The Adeptus Mechanicus ultimately classified Nightsiders as stable Abhuman strains, though their status remained somewhat ambiguous compared to more extensively divergent populations like Ogryns. This classification granted them legal recognition and protection under Imperial law, while acknowledging their obvious differences from baseline humanity. The decision reflected pragmatic considerations as much as genetic analysis, as Nightsider populations existed on numerous worlds throughout the Imperium, and their capabilities proved useful for specific military and industrial applications. Denying them Abhuman status would have complicated administration of the worlds they inhabited and eliminated potential sources of specialized personnel for operations requiring enhanced night vision capabilities. The military employment of Nightsiders focused almost exclusively on operations in low light or darkness conditions where their enhanced vision provided clear advantages. Imperial Guard regiments recruiting from Nightsider worlds deployed these troops for night raids, tunnel fighting, and combat in environments like underhives or dense forests, where limited visibility disadvantaged baseline human soldiers. Nightsider scouts excelled at nocturnal reconnaissance, observing enemy positions and movements in darkness that would require baseline humans to use artificial light amplification equipment. Their natural night vision proved more reliable than technological solutions, as it required no power source, produced no electronic signature that enemies might detect, and functioned effectively even when electromagnetic interference or equipment damage would disable night vision goggles. Void combat and boarding actions represented another area where Nightsider capabilities found application. Ship corridors and compartments often experienced lighting failures during combat, whether from battle damage, power fluctuations, or deliberate enemy action to disable illumination systems. Nightsiders could continue fighting effectively in darkness that would leave baseline human troops disoriented and vulnerable, maintaining combat effectiveness when lighting failed and providing their units with significant tactical advantages. Imperial Navy boarding teams sometimes included Nightsider specialists specifically for operations where fighting in damaged, poorly lit enemy vessels seemed likely. The limitations affecting Nightsider military deployment proved as significant as their advantages. Their extreme photosensitivity meant they could not operate effectively in daylight conditions without extensive protective equipment that reduced their combat effectiveness. Commanders deploying Nightsider troops needed to carefully consider lighting conditions and timing of operations, as sending these Abhumans into bright environments essentially wasted their capabilities while exposing them to conditions that caused genuine suffering and potential injury. The specialized nature of situations where Nightsiders provided advantages meant that most Imperial Guard regiments recruited from their worlds maintained mixed forces, with baseline human troops handling operations in standard lighting, while Nightsider contingents deployed for night operations and low-light combat. The Void-born populations scattered throughout the Imperium represented a fundamentally different category of human adaptation than planet-bound Abhuman strains. These populations emerged not from environmental pressures on planetary surfaces, but from generations spent aboard spacecraft, orbital stations, and other installations where microgravity or minimal artificial gravity shaped human development. The Void-born traced their origins to various sources, including the crews of generation ships that traveled for centuries between stars during humanity's initial expansion, populations aboard massive space stations constructed during the dark age of technology, and the descendants of refugees who fled planetary disasters by taking to space permanently. The skeletal changes characterizing Void-born populations emerged as the most obvious marker of their adaptation to low-gravity environments. Human bones developed and maintained their density in response to mechanical stress from supporting body weight and resisting muscular forces under gravity. Remove that constant gravitational load, and bones responded by reducing their density and altering their structure to match the decreased mechanical demands. Void-born individuals showed elongated skeletons with reduced bone density throughout their frames, particularly in weight-bearing bones like the femur, tibia, and vertebral column. Their bones grew longer and thinner than baseline human equivalents, producing increased height without proportional increase in mass. The spinal columns of void-born humans showed particularly dramatic adaptation to microgravity conditions. Without gravity constantly compressing the spine, the intervertebral discs between vertebrae expanded and the vertebrae themselves elongated, producing void-born individuals who stood significantly taller than their genetic baseline would predict under standard gravity. This spinal elongation contributed substantially to overall height differences between void-born and planet-born humans, with some void-born populations averaging 10 to 15 centimeters taller than baseline humans of similar genetic background. The increased spacing between vertebrae granted void-born individuals exceptional flexibility, as their spines could bend and twist through greater ranges of motion than the compressed spines of gravity-adapted humans. Muscular atrophy represented another consistent feature of void-born physiology. Human muscles maintained their mass and strength through constant use against gravitational resistance, with even simple activities like standing or walking providing continuous low-level exercise that preserved muscle tissue. Void-born populations spent generations in environments where movement required minimal muscular effort, where pushing off surfaces provided all the force needed for locomotion, and where the constant struggle against gravity that shaped baseline human musculature simply did not exist. Their muscles adapted by reducing mass and altering fiber composition, producing void-born individuals with visibly reduced muscle definition compared to planet-born humans. The cardiovascular systems of void-born populations underwent adaptations that proved less visible but equally significant. Human hearts evolved to pump blood against gravitational resistance, maintaining blood pressure sufficient to supply the brain with oxygenated blood despite gravity constantly pulling blood toward the lower body. Void-born hearts developed in environments where gravity provided minimal resistance to blood flow, allowing them to pump less forcefully while still maintaining adequate circulation. Their blood vessels similarly adapted to low-gravity conditions, with altered diameter and elasticity that optimized them for microgravity circulation, but made them less effective at maintaining blood pressure under standard gravity. The distinction between void-born populations and true Abhumans generated extensive debate within the Adeptus Terra and Genitor Biologus communities. The physical changes characterizing void-born humans resulted entirely from developmental plasticity rather than genetic mutation or evolutionary adaptation. A void-born individual possessed essentially the same genome as baseline humans, with their distinctive physical characteristics emerging from how that genome expressed itself under microgravity conditions during development. Genitor researchers demonstrated this by showing that void-born parents who settled on planetary surfaces and raised children under standard gravity produced offspring with much more baseline typical physiology, though some void-born characteristics persisted due to epigenetic factors and maternal environment effects. This developmental rather than genetic basis for void-born characteristics led many genitor researchers to argue against classifying them as true Abhumans. They contended that void-born populations represented phenotypic variation resulting from environmental conditions during development rather than stable genetic divergence. The fact that void-born traits could be largely reversed through environmental modification distinguished them fundamentally from true Abhuman strains like Ogryns or Ratlings, whose characteristics resulted from fixed genetic changes that persisted regardless of environment. These researchers proposed alternative classifications that recognized void-born distinctiveness, while avoiding the abhuman designation with its implications of permanent genetic divergence. The counterargument emphasized that practical considerations mattered more than theoretical distinctions between genetic and developmental causation. Void-born populations existed throughout Imperial space in numbers potentially exceeding many recognized Abhuman strains. Their physical characteristics created real challenges for integration into standard Imperial military and civilian structures, while simultaneously providing genuine advantages for void operations. Whether their traits resulted from genes or development made little difference to commanders who needed to decide how to employ void-born personnel, or to administrators managing mixed populations of planet-born and void-born citizens. The Abhuman classification provided a legal and administrative framework for managing these populations that would otherwise require creating entirely new categories. The Adeptus Terra ultimately declined to formally classify void-born populations as Abhumans, though this decision reflected political and theological considerations as much as genetic analysis. The Adeptus Ministorum strongly opposed granting Abhuman status to void-born humans, arguing that their traits resulted from environmental factors rather than the genetic divergence that characterized true Abhumans. Ecclesiarchy theologians contended that void-born humans remained fully human in the genetic sense, and that their physical differences should be understood as environmental adaptations rather than mutations or evolutionary changes. This theological position found support among Imperial authorities, who preferred to avoid expanding the already controversial Abhuman classifications to include populations that might be understood as simply humans adapted to unusual environments. Despite lacking formal Abhuman classification, void-born populations received recognition as distinct demographic categories requiring special consideration in Imperial administration and military organization. The Adeptus Munitorum maintained separate recruiting and training protocols for void-born troops, acknowledging that their physical characteristics made them unsuitable for standard infantry roles, but valuable for specialized void operations. The Administratum tracked void-born populations separately in demographic records and implemented policies addressing their specific needs and capabilities. This practical accommodation without formal Abhuman status represented a compromise that satisfied theological concerns while addressing the real administrative challenges posed by void-born populations. The Imperial Navy employed void-born humans extensively throughout its operations, recognizing that their natural adaptation to microgravity made them ideal for shipboard service. Void-born crew members moved through ship corridors and compartments with natural grace that planet-born sailors required extensive training to develop. They suffered none of the disorientation, nausea, or spatial confusion that often afflicted baseline humans during their initial exposure to microgravity. Their elongated frames and reduced muscle mass, disadvantages in planetary environments, became neutral or even beneficial characteristics aboard ships where physical strength mattered less than the ability to navigate three-dimensional spaces efficiently. Rogue trader dynasties showed particular interest in recruiting void-born personnel for their vessels and expeditions. These independent merchant explorers valued crew members who could function effectively during extended void voyages without the medical complications that affected planet-born humans spending years in low-gravity environments. Void-born crew required no special exercise regimens or medical interventions to prevent the bone density loss and muscle atrophy that threatened planet-born sailors on long voyages. Their natural comfort in microgravity made them valuable for external hull repairs, cargo handling in unpressurized holds, and other tasks where working in vacuum and zero gravity proved necessary. Some rogue trader dynasties recruited exclusively from void-born populations for certain crew positions, recognizing the operational advantages these personnel provided. The merchant fleets plying trade routes between Imperial worlds similarly employed void-born crews extensively. Commercial vessels often operated with minimal artificial gravity, to reduce power consumption and maintenance requirements, creating environments where void-born crew members functioned more effectively than planet-born alternatives. Their reduced nutritional requirements due to lower muscle mass made them cheaper to maintain on long voyages, where cargo space came at a premium, and every kilogram of supplies represented reduced profit margins. Merchant captains valued void-born crew for their reliability in void operations and their ability to work efficiently in the low-gravity conditions that commercial vessels maintained to maximize operational economy. The tactical advantages void-born personnel provided in boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat proved significant enough that some Imperial Navy vessels maintained specialized void-born boarding teams. These units trained specifically for combat in damaged or depressurized ship sections where gravity had failed and where fighting occurred in three-dimensional microgravity environments. Void-born boarders moved through these spaces with natural facility, using their elongated limbs to brace against surfaces and control their movement while engaging enemies who struggled with the disorienting conditions. Their reduced mass made them easier to accelerate and maneuver in microgravity, allowing rapid repositioning and tactical flexibility that baseline human troops found difficult to match. The limitations affecting void-born populations proved severe when they attempted to function in standard gravity environments. Their reduced bone density made them vulnerable to fractures from impacts or stresses that baseline humans would barely notice. Simple falls that might bruise a planet-born human could break void-born bones, while the constant stress of supporting their body weight under standard gravity caused chronic pain and potential compression fractures in their elongated spines. Their weakened cardiovascular systems struggled to maintain adequate blood pressure under gravity, with many void-born individuals experiencing dizziness, fainting, or more serious circulatory problems when exposed to standard gravity for extended periods. Medical interventions could partially address void-born limitations in planetary environments. Pharmaceutical treatments promoted bone density increase and muscle development, though these required sustained administration and produced only modest improvements. Exoskeletal support frames provided mechanical assistance that allowed void-born individuals to function under standard gravity without risking skeletal damage, though such equipment proved expensive and cumbersome. Some void-born populations underwent genetic therapy or surgical interventions designed to make them more compatible with planetary environments, though these procedures carried significant risks and often produced incomplete results. The general consensus among Imperial medical authorities held that void-born humans functioned best when they remained in the low-gravity environments to which their physiology had adapted. The social dynamics between planet-born and void-born populations varied considerably across the Imperium. Some worlds with significant orbital infrastructure and large void-born populations developed integrated societies where both groups interacted regularly and where void-born citizens enjoyed full legal rights and social acceptance. These populations recognized void-born humans as fellow citizens whose physical differences resulted from their environment rather than any fundamental inferiority or corruption. Other worlds viewed void-born populations with suspicion or disdain, seeing their elongated frames and physical weakness under gravity as signs of degeneration or mutation. Void-born individuals visiting such worlds faced discrimination and hostility that sometimes escalated into violence. The theological status of void-born humans within the Imperial Creed generated less controversy than that of recognized Abhuman strains, as their genetic similarity to baseline humanity made their essential human nature difficult to dispute. The ecclesiarchy acknowledged void-born humans as fully human in the theological sense, possessing souls capable of salvation and deserving of the Emperor's protection. Ministorum priests serving aboard void stations and ships conducted services that made no distinction between planet-born and void-born congregants, treating all as equal in their humanity and their relationship to the Emperor. This theological acceptance provided important legal and social protections for void-born populations, ensuring they received recognition as legitimate Imperial citizens, regardless of their physical distinctiveness. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains a complex organizational framework for managing Abhuman forces within the Imperial Guard, reflecting both the practical utility and persistent complications these troops present. The fundamental structure divides Abhuman military personnel into three primary deployment categories: segregated Abhuman regiments, mixed formation units combining Abhuman and baseline human troops, and specialized detachments attached to standard Imperial Guard formations. Each approach carries distinct advantages and challenges that Imperial military planners must balance against operational requirements, logistical constraints, and the political realities of integrating visibly non-human troops into an institution built around baseline human norms. Segregated Abhuman regiments represent the most straightforward organizational approach, grouping Ogryns, Ratlings, or other Abhuman strains into dedicated formations under their own command structures. The Adeptus Munitorum designates these units as Militarum Auxilia rather than standard Imperial Guard regiments, a classification that acknowledges their distinct nature while maintaining their official status as Imperial military forces. Ogryn regiments typically organize around company-sized formations of 200 to 300 Abhuman troops, supported by proportionally larger command elements than equivalent baseline human units. The increased officer-to-soldier ratio reflects the supervision requirements inherent in commanding troops with limited cognitive capacity, with each Ogryn squad requiring direct oversight from human or bone-enhanced Ogryn leaders who can translate complex tactical situations into simple, actionable orders. The command structure of segregated Ogryn regiments places baseline human officers in senior leadership positions, while utilizing bone-enhanced Ogryns as squad leaders and junior officers who provide immediate tactical direction. This arrangement recognizes that even enhanced Ogryns rarely develop the strategic thinking necessary for regimental command, while acknowledging their value for maintaining discipline and morale among Abhuman troops who respond better to leaders they recognize as their own kind. Human officers assigned to Ogryn regiments undergo specialized training emphasizing clear communication, patience with cognitive limitations, and understanding of Ogryn psychology. The most effective commanders develop genuine rapport with their Abhuman troops, learning to work within Ogryn capabilities rather than attempting to force them into operational patterns designed for baseline humans. Ratling regiments organize differently than their Ogryn counterparts, reflecting the distinct capabilities and behavioral patterns of these Abhumans. A typical rattling formation consists of multiple sniper companies, each comprising 50 to 100 Ratlings organized into small teams of 3 to 5 shooters. These teams operate with considerable autonomy, as effective sniper operations require flexibility and independent decision-making that rigid command structures would compromise. Rattling squad leaders, usually the most experienced marksmen, coordinate with company commanders to deploy their teams where they can provide maximum tactical benefit. The command hierarchy in rattling regiments remains flatter than standard Imperial Guard structures, acknowledging that these Abhumans possess sufficient intelligence and initiative to operate effectively without constant supervision. Mixed formation regiments combining Abhuman and baseline human troops attempt to leverage the complementary capabilities of different troop types while maintaining unified command structures. These units typically feature core infantry companies of baseline humans supported by attached Ogryn assault squads and rattling sniper teams. The organizational challenge lies in integrating troops with vastly different capabilities, equipment requirements, and operational characteristics into cohesive fighting forces. Successful mixed regiments develop tactical doctrines that employ each troop type in roles suited to their strengths while minimizing situations where their limitations create vulnerabilities. Infantry companies advance with Ogryn squads providing breakthrough capability and close-quarters muscle, while rattling snipers eliminate high-value targets and provide reconnaissance. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains extensive documentation on deployment doctrines for Abhuman forces, though actual implementation varies considerably based on local conditions and commander preferences. Official doctrine emphasizes using Ogryns for frontal assaults, urban combat, and any situation requiring troops to physically break through obstacles or enemy positions. Their resilience makes them ideal for absorbing casualties during advances across open ground or through kill zones where baseline human troops would suffer unsustainable losses. Tactical manuals recommend deploying Ogryns in the first wave of assaults to create breaches that subsequent waves can exploit, using their physical power to overwhelm enemy positions before defenders can establish effective resistance. Ratling deployment doctrine focuses on maximizing their marksmanship and stealth capabilities, while protecting them from situations where their physical limitations become critical vulnerabilities. Official guidance recommends positioning rattling snipers in overwatch positions covering advancing infantry, where they can eliminate enemy officers, heavy weapons crews, and specialists whose deaths disrupt enemy operations. Their reconnaissance capabilities make them valuable for pre-assault intelligence gathering, though commanders must ensure rattling scouts receive adequate support and extraction plans given their inability to fight effectively if discovered by enemy forces. The doctrine explicitly warns against deploying ratlings in assault roles or expecting them to hold positions against determined enemy attacks, as their small size and limited combat power make them unsuitable for conventional infantry operations. Specialized deployment of Abhuman forces extends beyond simple tactical employment to encompass strategic-level decisions about where and when to commit these troops. The Adeptus Munitorum considers Abhuman capabilities when assigning regiments to specific war zones, attempting to match troop characteristics with operational environments. Ogryn regiments frequently deploy to urban warfare zones, tunnel fighting operations, and campaigns requiring sustained close-quarters combat where their strengths provide maximum advantage. Rattling formations see assignment to campaigns involving extended siege operations, guerrilla warfare against insurgent forces, or any situation where precision marksmanship and reconnaissance prove more valuable than raw combat power. The logistical challenges of supporting Abhuman forces prove substantially more complex than managing equivalent baseline human units. Ogryn regiments require specialized equipment scaled to accommodate their massive frames and tremendous strength. Standard Imperial Guard weapons would simply break apart in Ogryn hands, necessitating custom-manufactured Ripper guns built to withstand the forces these Abhumans exert during normal operation. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains dedicated production facilities on worlds like Anarch Zeta, specifically for manufacturing Ogryn equipment, as standard Forge worlds often lack the tooling or expertise necessary for producing gear at the required scale. Transport of this equipment adds further complications, as Ogryn weapons and armor occupy substantially more cargo space than baseline human equivalents while serving far fewer troops. Rations represent another persistent logistical challenge when supporting Ogryn forces. A single Ogryn consumes food quantities that would feed 3 to 5 baseline human soldiers, their massive frames and high metabolic rates demanding constant caloric intake to maintain combat effectiveness. Supply officers planning operations involving Ogryn regiments must account for these increased nutritional requirements when calculating transport capacity and establishing supply lines. Campaigns in regions with limited local food production or extended supply lines sometimes face difficult decisions about whether the combat advantages Ogryns provide justify the logistical burden of feeding them. Some commanders reluctantly decline Ogryn reinforcements when supply situations prove precarious, calculating that the additional troops would consume resources needed to sustain existing forces. Rattling logistical requirements differ dramatically from Ogryn needs, but create equally significant complications. These Abhumans require standard-sized equipment and weapons, eliminating the manufacturing challenges that plague Ogryn supply chains, but their behavioral characteristics generate persistent procurement problems. Ratling units experience equipment loss rates far exceeding baseline human formations, as items mysteriously disappear from inventories only to reappear in rattling possession or turn up in local markets where Ratlings have traded them for food or cooking supplies. Supply officers learn to maintain larger equipment reserves when supporting rattling formations, accounting for the inevitable attrition from rattling acquisition activities. Some pragmatic quartermasters establish informal systems where they provide Ratlings with extra rations or cooking equipment in exchange for reduced pilferage of critical military supplies. The specialized nature of rattling operations creates additional supply complications around ammunition and sniper equipment. Long las rifles require different power packs than standard lasguns, and maintaining adequate supplies of these specialized components demands careful coordination with Forge Worlds producing them. Rattling snipers consume ammunition at lower rates than line infantry, but require higher quality optical equipment, rangefinders, and other precision instruments that prove more expensive and difficult to replace than standard infantry gear. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains specialized supply depots stocking rattling-specific equipment, though these facilities concentrate in major logistics hubs rather than distributing throughout the Imperium's supply network. Accommodation requirements for Abhuman troops force Imperial forces to modify standard billeting and transport arrangements. Ogryn barracks require reinforced bunks capable of supporting their tremendous mass, enlarged doorways and corridors to accommodate their bulk, and structural reinforcement to prevent damage from normal Ogryn movement through facilities designed for baseline humans. Troop transports carrying Ogryn units need modified seating that can bear their weight and provide sufficient space for their frames. Some Chimera variants incorporate specialized Ogryn compartments with reinforced floors and larger hatches, though many Ogryn units simply ride exposed on vehicle hulls rather than attempting to squeeze into standard troop compartments. Rattling accommodation needs prove less structurally demanding, but create different complications. These Abhumans inevitably modify any space they occupy, somehow acquiring cushions, cooking equipment, and various comfort items that transform Spartan military billets into surprisingly livable quarters. Commanders learn to conduct regular inspections of rattling areas, confiscating contraband, and ensuring these troops maintain at least minimal military standards in their living spaces. The persistent rattling focus on food preparation means their quarters require enhanced fire safety measures, as these Abhumans will attempt to cook meals using any available heat source regardless of regulations or safety considerations. Medical support for Abhuman forces requires specialized training and equipment that standard Imperial Guard Medicae personnel often lack. Ogryn physiology differs sufficiently from baseline humans that conventional medical procedures prove ineffective or dangerous when applied to these Abhumans. Their redundant organs mean that injuries that would kill normal humans might only incapacitate Ogryns, but determining which organs remain functional and which require treatment demands knowledge of Ogryn anatomy that most field medics never receive. Their tremendous pain tolerance means Ogryns often continue fighting with injuries they should report for treatment, only collapsing when damage accumulates beyond even their impressive resilience. Medicae staff supporting Ogryn units learn to conduct regular physical inspections rather than relying on Ogryns to report injuries, as these Abhumans frequently fail to recognize when they need medical attention. Rattling medical needs center less on trauma treatment than on addressing the health complications their behavioral patterns create. These Abhumans suffer digestive problems from consuming questionable food they acquire through their procurement activities, requiring Medicae personnel to treat food poisoning and parasitic infections at rates far exceeding baseline human troops. Their small size makes them vulnerable to injuries that would prove minor for larger beings, with broken bones and crushing injuries occurring when Rattlings work around heavy equipment or in environments scaled for baseline humans. Some rattling populations show genetic predisposition towards certain metabolic disorders related to their unusual digestive efficiency, requiring ongoing medical monitoring and treatment that adds to the burden on regimental Medicae facilities. The social dynamics between Abhuman and baseline human troops within the Astra Militarum span the full spectrum from genuine camaraderie to open hostility, shaped by factors including regimental culture, individual experiences, and the attitudes soldiers bring from their homeworlds. Regiments recruited from worlds with established Abhuman populations generally show greater acceptance of Abhuman troops, as their soldiers grew up seeing Ogryns or Ratlings as normal parts of their communities. These units integrate Abhuman and baseline human personnel with minimal friction, their troops having learned from childhood how to interact effectively with Abhumans and understanding both their capabilities and limitations. Veterans from such regiments often express genuine affection for their Abhuman comrades, viewing them as valued members of their military family, deserving respect and protection. Regiments from worlds with limited Abhuman presence or strong purity traditions frequently struggle with integrating Abhuman troops into their formations. Soldiers who never encountered Abhumans before military service often react with revulsion or fear when first assigned to units including Ogryns or Ratlings. Their homeworld cultures may have taught them that any deviation from baseline human form indicates corruption or inferiority, creating prejudices that interfere with unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. These troops view Abhumans as barely human creatures whose presence in Imperial forces represents an unfortunate necessity rather than a source of military strength. They avoid social interaction with Abhuman personnel, refuse to share quarters or facilities with them, and sometimes engage in harassment or abuse that undermines discipline and morale. Combat experience tends to moderate anti-Abhuman prejudice among troops who actually fight alongside these auxiliaries. Soldiers who witness Ogryns absorbing fire that would have killed them, who see rattling snipers eliminating threats before they can engage friendly forces, or who benefit from Abhuman capabilities in desperate situations, develop appreciation for what these troops contribute regardless of their appearance. The shared experience of combat creates bonds that transcend physical differences, as soldiers recognize that Abhuman troops bleed for the Emperor just as they do, and that their survival often depends on Abhuman capabilities. Veterans with extensive combat experience, alongside Abhumans, frequently become their strongest advocates, defending them against prejudice from replacement troops and insisting on the tactical value these auxiliaries provide. The role of commissars in managing human-Abhuman relations within Imperial Guard formations proves critical for maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness. These political officers enforce Imperial military law without regard to species, holding both baseline humans and Abhumans accountable to identical standards of conduct and performance. Commissars assigned to mixed species units receive training in managing the unique challenges these formations present, learning to identify and address tensions before they escalate into violence or mutiny. They punish baseline human soldiers who abuse or discriminate against Abhuman troops with the same severity they apply to any breach of military discipline, making clear that prejudice that undermines unit cohesion will not be tolerated. Commissars working with Ogryn units face particular challenges in applying standard disciplinary measures to troops whose limited intelligence makes them unsuitable targets for conventional punishment or motivation. These officers learn to work through the personal bonds Ogryns form with their commanders, using the Abhumans' loyalty and desire to please rather than fear of punishment as their primary disciplinary tool. An Ogryn who fails to follow orders or makes tactical errors responds better to patient correction and clear explanation than to threats or violence, as these Abhumans genuinely want to serve effectively but often struggle to understand complex situations. Commissars who attempt to impose discipline through intimidation or summary execution typically discover that such approaches prove counterproductive with Ogryns, who become confused and distressed rather than motivated by harsh treatment. Rattling troops present different disciplinary challenges that require commissars to balance enforcement of military standards against the practical reality that these Abhumans will engage in procurement activities regardless of regulations. Effective commissars learn to distinguish between rattling behavior that merely annoys baseline human troops and actions that genuinely threaten operational security or unit cohesion. They establish clear boundaries around what acquisitions they will tolerate and what crosses into unacceptable theft, then enforce those boundaries consistently. A commissar who attempts to completely eliminate rattling procurement activities will fail and lose credibility, but one who focuses on preventing theft of critical military supplies while overlooking minor infractions can maintain acceptable discipline without constant conflict. Notable Abhuman regiments and their combat records demonstrate the tactical value these forces provide when properly employed and supported. The Ogryn regiments raised from Anarch Zeta have served with distinction across numerous campaigns, their troops benefiting from the specialized training facilities and enhancement programs concentrated on that world. These formations participated in the Sabbat World's crusade, where their resilience and close-quarters combat power proved essential for urban fighting in contested hive cities. Anarch Zeta Ogryn units distinguished themselves during the Siege of Vervenhive, where they held critical positions against repeated enemy assaults and conducted counterattacks that broke enemy formations attempting to penetrate Imperial defensive lines. The Bronshan Longknives, a mixed regiment incorporating substantial Ogryn contingents alongside baseline human troops from Brontus Secundus, earned recognition for their effectiveness in jungle warfare during campaigns on death worlds throughout the Segmentum Pacificus. The regiment's commanders developed tactics that used Ogryn squads to clear paths through dense vegetation and hostile wildlife that would have slowed or stopped conventional infantry formations. Their Ogryns proved particularly effective against the massive predatory creatures inhabiting these worlds, as the Abhumans possessed sufficient strength to fight such beasts in close combat, while their resilience allowed them to survive attacks that would kill baseline humans. The Longknives' combat record includes successful campaigns on 7 separate death worlds, with their Ogryn troops accounting for a disproportionate share of enemy casualties, despite representing less than a quarter of regimental strength. Rattling sniper detachments from various recruitment worlds have compiled impressive records of enemy kills and successful reconnaissance missions across the Imperium's endless wars. The Mushan sharpshooters, drawn from rattling populations on several worlds in the Moot region, served throughout the Macharian Crusade, providing long-range fire support and intelligence gathering for advancing Imperial forces. Their snipers eliminated enemy commanders and specialists at ranges exceeding standard infantry engagement distances, disrupting enemy command structures and degrading their combat effectiveness. One Mushan sniper team achieved documented kills at ranges approaching 2 kilometers during operations on open plains worlds, demonstrating the extreme capabilities rattling marksmanship could achieve under ideal conditions. The 42nd Firstborn Rattling Regiment distinguished itself during the defense of Cadia before the planet's destruction, with their sniper teams providing critical overwatch support for Imperial defensive positions. Rattling snipers from this formation eliminated Chaos Space Marine champions, cultist leaders, and demon-summoning sorcerers whose deaths prevented enemy breakthroughs at critical moments. The regiment suffered heavy casualties during the final stages of the campaign, with many rattling troops dying at their posts rather than abandoning positions they had been ordered to hold. Survivors of the 42nd Firstborn received commendations for their service and formed the core of reconstituted rattling formations that continue to serve in campaigns across the Segmentum Obscurus. Mixed formation successes demonstrate that properly integrated Abhuman and baseline human forces can achieve results exceeding what either troop type could accomplish independently. The Kanak Skull Takers, a regiment from the feral world of Kanak, incorporated Ogryn auxiliaries into their standard infantry companies with remarkable effectiveness. The regiment's culture emphasized physical prowess and combat ferocity, values that aligned well with Ogryn characteristics and created natural acceptance of the Abhumans as fellow warriors. Kanak commanders deployed their Ogryns as breakthrough elements supported by baseline human infantry, who exploited the gaps Ogryn assaults created, developing tactics that maximized the complementary capabilities of both troop types. The regiment's combat record includes successful campaigns against Orc invasions, Chaos insurgencies, and Xenos incursions across multiple war zones. The Tanith First and Only, though primarily a baseline human light infantry regiment, successfully incorporated Rattling sniper teams into their reconnaissance-focused operations. The regiment's commander recognized that Rattling capabilities aligned perfectly with the Tanith tactical doctrine, emphasizing stealth, marksmanship, and unconventional warfare. Rattling scouts provided intelligence-gathering capabilities that enhanced the regiment's already formidable reconnaissance operations, while their snipers eliminated targets that even skilled Tanith marksmen struggled to engage at extreme ranges. The integration proved so successful that other light infantry regiments began requesting Rattling attachments, recognizing the force multiplication these Abhumans provided for units employing similar tactical approaches. The Genitor Biologists Magos occupy a unique position within the Adeptus Mechanicus hierarchy, their domain encompassing the study and classification of biological systems across the Imperium's vast territories. These tech priests pursue knowledge of organic life with the same fervor their colleagues apply to understanding machine systems, though their work receives less reverence within the cult Mechanicus than the study of sacred technology. The Genitor specialty divides into numerous subdisciplines, with particular branches dedicated to cataloging and monitoring Abhuman populations throughout Imperial space. These specialists maintain vast biological archives on forge worlds and research stations, accumulating genetic samples, physiological data, and breeding records that span millennia of observation. The primary responsibility of Genitor Biologists teams working with Abhuman populations centers on monitoring genetic stability across generations. The Imperium's acceptance of Abhuman strains rests fundamentally on the requirement that these populations breed true, producing offspring that consistently display parental characteristics without excessive mutation or genetic drift. Genitor research stations, scattered across worlds hosting significant Abhuman populations, conduct regular genetic surveys, collecting tissue samples and analyzing them for signs of instability. These surveys occur on cycles ranging from decades to centuries, depending on the strain being monitored and the resources available for testing. The data flows back to Forge World archives, where Genitors maintain comprehensive genetic profiles for each recognized Abhuman strain. The classification work performed by Genitor Biologists extends beyond simple monitoring to encompass the evaluation of newly encountered populations that might qualify for Abhuman recognition. When Imperial forces contact isolated human populations displaying unusual characteristics, local authorities forward samples and documentation to the nearest Forge world with Genitor facilities. The tech priests conduct extensive genetic analysis, comparing the population's genome against baseline human standards and established Abhuman profiles. They measure the degree of genetic divergence, assess whether the changes breed true across generations, and evaluate the stability of the population's genetic expression. This process generates detailed technical reports that form the scientific foundation for administrative decisions about whether to grant Abhuman status or classify the population as unstable mutants. Genitor research into Abhuman genetics reveals patterns that illuminate the mechanisms underlying human adaptation to extreme environments. The tech priests document how specific environmental pressures correlate with particular genetic changes, building models that predict which adaptations might emerge under given conditions. Their work demonstrates that certain genetic pathways prove more susceptible to environmental influence than others, with genes controlling skeletal development, sensory capabilities, and metabolic processes showing particular plasticity under selective pressure. The Genitors catalog these patterns across multiple Abhuman strains, identifying commonalities that suggest universal principles governing human genetic response to environmental stress. The question of whether Abhuman strains represent evolutionary endpoints or transitional forms generates ongoing debate within Genitor circles. Some researchers argue that recognized Abhuman populations have achieved stable adaptations that will persist indefinitely barring dramatic environmental changes or genetic intervention. They point to strains like Ogryns and Ratlings that have maintained consistent characteristics across thousands of years of observation, suggesting these populations reached equilibrium states where further evolution proceeds at negligible rates. Other genetors contend that all Abhuman strains remain in flux, continuing to diverge from baseline humanity through accumulated genetic changes too subtle to detect across mere millennia of observation. These researchers predict that given sufficient time, current Abhuman strains might diverge far enough to become reproductively incompatible with baseline humans, effectively splitting into separate species. The discovery of genetic markers associated with warp sensitivity in certain Abhuman populations sparked intensive research efforts among genitor teams studying the intersection of biology and psychic phenomena. Tech priests analyzing Beastmen genetic sequences identified unusual patterns in genes associated with neural development and cellular response to psychic energy. These markers appeared with much higher frequency in Beastmen populations than in baseline humans or other Abhuman strains, suggesting a genetic component to their documented susceptibility to chaos corruption. The research raised troubling questions about whether genetic predisposition toward warp sensitivity could be identified and potentially eliminated through selective breeding or genetic manipulation, though such programs would require resources and timescales beyond what most genitor facilities could support. The debate within the Mechanicus regarding Abhuman enhancement through augmentation reflects fundamental tensions between different interpretations of the cult Mechanicus doctrine. Traditional Mechanicus philosophy holds that flesh represents weakness to be overcome through replacement with superior mechanical systems. Tech priests routinely replace their own biological components with augmetic alternatives, viewing this transformation as spiritual advancement toward the perfection of the machine. Extending this logic to Abhumans suggests that their genetic adaptations, while useful, remain inferior to what could be achieved through cybernetic enhancement. Some genitor factions advocate for extensive augmentation of Abhuman troops, arguing that replacing their biological adaptations with mechanical equivalents would improve their capabilities while bringing them closer to the Omnissiah's ideal form. Progressive elements within the genitor biologies oppose extensive Abhuman augmentation on both practical and philosophical grounds. They argue that Abhuman adaptations represent successful biological solutions to specific environmental or tactical challenges, and that replacing these natural capabilities with mechanical systems risks losing advantages that evolved over thousands of generations. An Ogryn's tremendous natural strength emerges from complex interactions between dense musculature, reinforced skeletal structure, and metabolic systems optimized for supporting massive frames. Replacing these integrated biological systems with augmetic equivalents might provide comparable strength, but would eliminate the redundancy and resilience that make Ogryns so difficult to kill. These genitors contend that biological and mechanical systems each possess distinct advantages, and that the optimal approach involves selective augmentation that enhances natural capabilities rather than wholesale replacement. The limits of acceptable modification for Abhuman populations generate fierce arguments among Mechanicus authorities responsible for approving enhancement programs. Standard Imperial doctrine prohibits genetic manipulation of human populations, viewing such interference as dangerous heresy that risks creating abominations or unleashing uncontrolled mutations. The Adeptus Mechanicus operates under somewhat different constraints, as their mandate to pursue knowledge and their semi-autonomous status within the Imperium grant them greater flexibility in conducting biological research. However, even the Mechanicus faces restrictions on human genetic manipulation, with the Fabricator General and Senior Magi enforcing limits designed to prevent the creation of new Abhuman strains or the destabilization of existing populations through reckless experimentation. Augmentation programs targeting Abhuman populations typically focus on addressing specific limitations rather than attempting comprehensive enhancement. Ogryn augmentation efforts concentrate on cognitive enhancement through neural implants and biochemical treatments like the bone program, accepting their physical characteristics as adequate while attempting to improve their tactical utility through increased intelligence. These programs operate within established limits that prohibit alterations affecting Ogryn breeding populations or changes that might destabilize their genetic heritage. Individual Ogryns receiving enhancement remain capable of producing normal Ogryn offspring, ensuring that augmentation affects only the treated generation rather than propagating through subsequent populations. Rattling augmentation proves less common than Ogryn enhancement, as these Abhumans possess sufficient intelligence and capability that extensive modification seems unnecessary. Some rattling snipers receive optical augmetics that enhance their already exceptional vision, incorporating targeting systems and range-finding capabilities directly into their visual processing. These implants build on natural rattling visual acuity rather than replacing it, using their biological capabilities as foundations for technological enhancement. The relatively light augmentation typical of rattling troops reflects Mechanicus' assessment that these Abhumans already function effectively in their specialized roles, and that extensive modification would provide minimal benefit while risking complications from surgery on their small frames. The philosophical conflict between augmentation advocates and those favoring natural adaptation extends into debates about the fundamental nature of humanity and the Omnissiah's plan for the species. Tech priests emphasizing mechanical perfection argue that the Omnissiah's gift of technology represents the intended path for human evolution, and that biological adaptation through environmental pressure constitutes a primitive and inefficient alternative to purposeful mechanical enhancement. They view Abhuman strains as unfortunate necessities, whose existence demonstrates humanity's failure to properly embrace the Omnissiah's gifts during the Age of Strife. These genetors advocate for gradually replacing Abhuman biological adaptations with superior mechanical equivalents, working toward an eventual future where all humanity exists in optimized cybernetic forms regardless of their genetic heritage. Naturalist factions within the genitor biologies counter that biological adaptation represents the Omnissiah's work operating through natural law rather than direct intervention. They argue that the human genome's capacity for adaptation to diverse environments demonstrates divine design, with the genetic plasticity that produced Abhuman strains reflecting intentional capability rather than flaw. These tech priests view Abhuman populations as successful expressions of humanity's adaptive potential, worthy of preservation and study rather than replacement. They contend that the Omnissiah works through both biological and mechanical means, and that dismissing natural adaptation as primitive represents a dangerous narrowing of perspective that ignores half of the Omnissiah's methods. The role of Abhuman populations in Forge World labor forces provides practical demonstration of how Mechanicus authorities balance ideological concerns against operational requirements. Major Forge worlds throughout the Imperium employ Abhuman workers in specialized roles suited to their unique physiologies. Ogryn labor gangs handle the heaviest industrial tasks, moving massive components that would require expensive machinery for baseline human workers to manipulate. Their tremendous strength and resilience make them ideal for working in hazardous environments, where industrial accidents that would kill normal workers merely injure Ogryns, who return to duty after brief medical treatment. Forge World administrators calculate that employing Ogryns for heavy labor proves more cost-effective than maintaining equivalent lifting equipment, as the Abhumans require only food and basic quarters rather than fuel, maintenance, and eventual replacement. Rattling workers find employment in Forge World facilities requiring precision manipulation and work in confined spaces. Their small size allows them to access machinery internals and tight crawl spaces that baseline human workers cannot reach without disassembling equipment. Manufacturing facilities producing small components or intricate devices sometimes employ rattling workers whose natural manual dexterity and excellent close-range vision suit them for assembly work requiring fine motor control. The persistent problem of rattling procurement activities affects Forge World operations just as it does military units, with administrators learning to secure valuable components and materials while accepting that Ratlings will inevitably acquire items through unofficial channels. Some Forge Worlds establish controlled markets where Ratlings can trade their labor for food and minor luxuries, channeling their acquisitive tendencies into less disruptive patterns. The specialized tasks assigned to Abhuman workers on Forge Worlds often involve conditions that baseline humans find intolerable without extensive protective equipment. Ogryn labor gangs work in high radiation zones where their natural resistance allows them to function without the heavy shielding normal workers require. They operate in extreme temperature environments, toxic atmosphere processing facilities, and other hazardous areas where their resilience provides significant operational advantages. Forge World authorities view this exploitation of Abhuman capabilities as entirely appropriate, seeing no ethical concerns in assigning these workers to dangerous conditions their biology allows them to survive. The calculus remains purely practical, balancing the cost of Abhuman labor against the expense of providing equivalent protection for baseline human workers. Research into reversing Abhuman mutations occupies a controversial niche within genitor biology's work, attracting both intense interest and significant opposition from different Mechanicus factions. Some tech priests pursue this research from purely scientific curiosity, seeking to understand whether the genetic changes defining Abhuman strains can be undone through targeted genetic manipulation. Their experiments involve attempting to identify and modify the specific genes responsible for Abhuman characteristics, testing whether reversing these changes would produce offspring displaying more baseline typical features. Early research efforts achieved limited success, demonstrating that some Abhuman traits could be suppressed or modified through genetic intervention, but that completely reversing the accumulated changes of thousands of generations proved far more difficult than anticipated. The practical applications of mutation reversal research extend beyond academic interest into potential solutions for Abhuman populations facing genetic degradation. Some Abhuman strains show signs of increasing instability, with higher mutation rates in recent generations suggesting their genetic foundations may be deteriorating. Genitor researchers investigating these populations seek to identify the causes of instability and develop interventions that might stabilize degrading strains before they deteriorate beyond recovery. This work proves technically challenging, as genetic instability typically results from accumulated damage across multiple genes rather than single-point mutations that might be easily corrected. The research requires extensive genetic sequencing, complex modeling of gene interactions, and careful testing to avoid interventions that might accelerate degradation rather than reversing it. The ethical implications of genetic manipulation within cult Mechanicus doctrine generate intense debate that reveals deep divisions within the priesthood. Conservative factions argue that human genetic heritage represents sacred trust that must be preserved against modification, viewing the genome as a divine template that should not be altered except to correct obvious defects or mutations. These tech priests oppose research into reversing Abhuman mutations, not because they value Abhuman characteristics, but because they fear that developing genetic manipulation capabilities might lead to uncontrolled experimentation that could destabilize humanity's genetic foundation. They point to the horrors of the Age of Strife, when uncontrolled genetic engineering contributed to humanity's near extinction, as cautionary examples of what happens when humans attempt to reshape their own biology without proper understanding or restraint. Progressive genitors counter that refusing to develop genetic manipulation capabilities leaves humanity vulnerable to genetic threats that natural processes cannot address. They argue that Abhuman strains showing signs of instability might be saved through careful genetic intervention, preserving populations that would otherwise face extinction or devolution into unstable mutant stocks. The research into mutation reversal provides knowledge that could prove essential for protecting baseline humanity if future environmental changes or warp phenomena threaten genetic stability on a broader scale. These tech priests contend that the Omnissiah grants humanity the capacity for understanding and manipulating biological systems just as surely as mechanical ones, and that refusing to develop these capabilities represents a failure to embrace the full scope of the Omnissiah's gifts. The question of consent in genetic manipulation programs targeting Abhuman populations receives minimal consideration from most Mechanicus authorities. Tech priests conducting research on Ogryn populations rarely concern themselves with whether individual Ogryns understand or approve of genetic testing and experimental treatments, viewing these Abhumans as suitable research subjects whose limited intelligence precludes meaningful consent. Ratlings receive somewhat more consideration due to their baseline equivalent intelligence, though genitor researchers still operate under the assumption that Abhuman populations exist to serve the Imperium's needs, and that their individual preferences matter less than potential benefits to Imperial operations. This utilitarian approach to research ethics reflects broader Mechanicus attitudes toward biological subjects, where the pursuit of knowledge and the Imperium's practical requirements override concerns about individual autonomy or rights. The stabilization of degrading Abhuman strains represents one of the most urgent practical applications of genitor research into Abhuman genetics. Several recognized Abhuman populations show concerning trends toward increased mutation rates and genetic instability that threaten their long-term viability. Genitor teams assigned to monitor these populations conduct intensive studies attempting to identify the causes of degradation and develop interventions that might arrest or reverse the process. The research reveals that genetic instability in Abhuman populations typically emerges from multiple factors, including accumulated genetic damage from environmental radiation, inbreeding depression in small populations, and the reactivation of normally suppressed genetic sequences that introduce unwanted variation into breeding populations. Intervention programs targeting unstable Abhuman strains employ various approaches depending on the specific causes identified through genetic analysis. Populations suffering from inbreeding depression receive genetic diversity enhancement through carefully controlled introduction of baseline human genetic material or genetic samples from more stable Abhuman populations of the same strain. These programs require delicate balancing to increase genetic diversity without introducing so much baseline human genetics that the population loses its distinctive Abhuman characteristics. Genitor researchers monitor multiple generations of mixed populations to ensure that interventions successfully stabilize the strain while preserving the adaptations that make them useful to the Imperium. Environmental factors contributing to genetic instability require different interventions focused on reducing exposure to mutagenic influences. Abhuman populations living in high radiation environments receive medical treatments that enhance their cellular repair mechanisms, reducing the accumulation of genetic damage across generations. Some populations relocate to less hazardous worlds where environmental pressures prove less severe, though such relocations create their own complications as Abhumans adapted to specific conditions often struggle in new environments. The genitors conducting these programs maintain long-term monitoring to assess whether their interventions successfully stabilize target populations or whether genetic degradation continues despite their efforts. The Adeptus Ministorum's official position on Abhuman souls emerged gradually over millennia of theological debate, evolving from the pragmatic acceptance of the Great Crusade era into increasingly rigid doctrines that reflected the Imperium's growing paranoia about genetic purity. The central question facing ecclesiarchy theologians concerned whether Abhumans possessed souls equivalent to baseline humans, capable of receiving the Emperor's grace and achieving salvation through faith and service. The Imperial Creed proclaimed the Emperor as humanity's savior and protector, but the definition of humanity itself remained contested when applied to beings whose physical forms diverged so dramatically from the baseline human template the Emperor himself exemplified. Conservative theological factions within the Ministorum argued that the human soul existed in direct relationship to the human form, and that significant physical deviation indicated corresponding spiritual degradation. These theologians pointed to the Emperor's own appearance as the ideal human form, reasoning that his physical perfection reflected his spiritual supremacy. Abhumans, with their altered bodies and mutated features, represented falling away from this divine template. The conservative position held that while Abhumans might possess souls, these souls existed in diminished or corrupted states that limited their capacity for true spiritual communion with the Emperor. This theological framework suggested that Abhumans could serve the Imperium through labor and military service, but that their spiritual status remained fundamentally inferior to baseline humans. Progressive elements within the ecclesiarchy developed counterarguments, emphasizing faith and loyalty over physical form. These theologians argued that the Emperor's domain extended over all humanity regardless of physical variation, and that genetic divergence did not necessarily indicate spiritual corruption. They pointed to documented cases of Abhumans displaying profound faith and making tremendous sacrifices in the Emperor's service, arguing that such devotion demonstrated the presence of souls fully capable of receiving divine grace. The progressive position held that the Emperor judged beings by their faith and actions rather than their physical characteristics, and that Abhumans who served loyally deserved recognition as true members of the Imperial faith community. The debate intensified around specific Abhuman strains, whose characteristics seemed to suggest varying degrees of spiritual status. Ratlings generated relatively little theological controversy due to their obvious intelligence and relatively minor physical divergence from baseline humanity. Most ecclesiarchy authorities accepted that Ratlings possessed souls equivalent to baseline humans, capable of faith, redemption, and salvation. Their participation in religious services showed genuine devotion, and their ability to comprehend theological concepts demonstrated cognitive capacity sufficient for meaningful spiritual life. The main theological concerns about Ratlings centered on their behavioral characteristics rather than their spiritual status, with some preachers condemning their thievery and comfort-seeking as moral failings rather than evidence of fundamental spiritual corruption. Ogryns presented more complex theological challenges due to their limited intelligence and dramatic physical divergence from baseline human norms. Conservative theologians questioned whether beings with such reduced cognitive capacity could truly comprehend the Imperial faith or exercise the moral agency necessary for salvation. They argued that Ogryns' simple-mindedness prevented them from understanding theological concepts beyond the most basic level, suggesting their spiritual development remained arrested at a childlike state. This position did not necessarily deny that Ogryns possessed souls, but it questioned whether those souls could achieve the full spiritual potential available to baseline humans. Some extreme conservative factions went further, arguing that Ogryn mutations indicated spiritual as well as physical degradation that placed them closer to animals than true humans. The progressive theological response emphasized that the Emperor valued loyalty and service over intellectual sophistication. Ogryn devotion to the Emperor, while simple and unsophisticated, represented genuine faith that the Emperor would recognize and honor. Their willingness to die in his service demonstrated spiritual worth that transcended their limited understanding of complex theology. Progressive preachers pointed out that many baseline humans showed equally limited comprehension of theological nuances, while still being accepted as faithful members of the Imperial Creed. The argument held that measuring spiritual worth by intellectual capacity represented a dangerous precedent that could exclude not just Ogryns, but also baseline humans of limited education or cognitive ability. Beastmen generated the most intense theological controversy and near-universal condemnation from ecclesiarchy authorities. Their animal features created immediate associations with chaos corruption, as followers of the ruinous powers frequently developed similar bestial characteristics through mutation. Conservative theologians argued that Beastmen physical forms represented visible evidence of spiritual corruption, with their animal features manifesting inner degradation that made them inherently susceptible to chaos influence. The documented high rates of chaos worship among Beastmen populations provided empirical support for theological arguments that these Abhumans possessed corrupted souls incapable of true faith or redemption. Most Ministorum authorities concluded that Beastmen existed beyond the Emperor's grace, their mutations marking them as forsaken beings whose physical corruption reflected spiritual damnation. The few theological defenders of Beastmen faced overwhelming opposition from mainstream ecclesiarchy doctrine. These rare progressive voices argued that Beastmen's susceptibility to chaos resulted from imperial persecution rather than inherent spiritual corruption, suggesting that Abhumans driven to desperation by discrimination naturally proved vulnerable to chaos promises of power and acceptance. They contended that Beastmen raised within the imperial faith and treated with basic dignity showed no greater tendency toward corruption than baseline humans in similar circumstances. This argument gained minimal traction within the Ministorum, as the combination of Beastmen appearance and their documented corruption rates created theological consensus that these Abhumans represented threats to spiritual purity that justified their exclusion from the imperial faith community. The question of whether Abhumans could serve as priests or hold positions of religious authority within the imperial cult generated fierce debate that revealed fundamental tensions in ecclesiarchy theology. Conservative factions adamantly opposed Abhuman clergy, arguing that spiritual leadership required not just faith, but also the physical and mental characteristics that marked true humanity. They contended that allowing Abhumans to serve as priests would degrade the sanctity of religious offices and create confusion about humanity's relationship with the Emperor. The conservative position held that while Abhumans might worship the Emperor, they lacked the spiritual authority necessary to lead baseline humans in religious observance or administer sacraments. Progressive theological voices argued that faith and devotion mattered more than physical form when determining suitability for religious service. They pointed out that the imperial creed emphasized the universality of the emperor's domain over humanity, and that excluding Abhumans from religious leadership based solely on their physical characteristics contradicted this fundamental principle. Some progressive preachers noted that certain Abhuman strains, particularly Ratlings, possessed intelligence and theological understanding equivalent to baseline humans, making their exclusion from clergy positions difficult to justify on intellectual grounds. These arguments achieved limited success, with most dioceses maintaining prohibitions against Abhuman priests, while a few scattered progressive congregations quietly allowed exceptional Abhumans to serve in minor religious roles. The practical reality across the Imperium's vast territories showed tremendous variation in how local imperial cult manifestations treated Abhuman participation in religious life. Some worlds welcomed Abhumans into their congregations without reservation, conducting services that made no distinction between baseline and Abhuman worshippers. These inclusive communities developed religious practices accommodating Abhuman characteristics, such as conducting services in simple language that Ogryns could follow or scheduling multiple services at different times to allow Ratlings to attend without disrupting their meal preparations. Abhuman participation in these congregations included full access to sacraments, participation in religious festivals, and recognition as legitimate members of the faith community. Other worlds segregated Abhumans into separate religious services or restricted their access to sacred spaces. These communities maintained that while Abhumans deserved opportunities to worship the Emperor, their presence alongside baseline humans in religious contexts proved inappropriate or disruptive. Segregated services allowed Abhuman worship while preserving the purity of baseline human religious observance, a compromise that satisfied neither progressive advocates for full integration nor conservative factions demanding complete Abhuman exclusion. Some particularly rigid communities barred Abhumans from entering major shrines or cathedrals entirely, designating separate minor chapels or outdoor spaces where Abhumans could conduct their devotions without contaminating sacred sites intended for baseline human worship. The development of Abhuman saints and their veneration within local imperial cult variations demonstrated that some communities recognized exceptional Abhumans as worthy of religious honor despite broader theological controversies. Several worlds hosting significant Ogryn populations developed local cults venerating Abhuman warriors who died heroically in the emperor's service. These saints typically achieved recognition through straightforward acts of physical courage and sacrifice that aligned with Ogryn capabilities, such as holding positions against overwhelming enemy forces or protecting baseline human civilians from danger at the cost of their own lives. Local preachers promoted these Abhuman saints as examples of how even limited beings could achieve spiritual greatness through loyalty and service, though the ecclesiarchy's central authorities rarely granted official recognition to such local cults. Rattling saints appeared less frequently in local religious traditions, as these Abhumans' behavioral characteristics made them less suitable subjects for hagiographic narratives emphasizing virtue and sacrifice. The few Rattling saints who achieved recognition typically earned their status through exceptional marksmanship that saved Imperial forces from defeat, or through acts of unexpected courage that contradicted stereotypes about Rattling cowardice. These local saints remained controversial even in communities that venerated them, with critics arguing that celebrating Abhumans as religious figures undermined proper hierarchy and confused the faithful about humanity's relationship with the emperor. The social hierarchy placing Abhumans above mutants, but definitively below baseline humans, manifested in countless legal and practical ways across Imperial society. The Lex Imperialis, that vast body of imperial law governing the Imperium's territories, established clear distinctions between recognized Abhumans and condemned mutants. Abhumans belonging to sanctioned strains enjoyed legal protections that prohibited arbitrary killing, enslavement, or abuse by baseline human citizens. These protections remained limited compared to rights afforded baseline humans, and enforcement varied dramatically depending on local authorities' attitudes, but they provided at least theoretical recourse against the most egregious mistreatment. Mutants lacked even these minimal protections, existing as non-persons under Imperial law whose lives held no legal value and who could be killed or exploited without consequence. The legal framework governing Abhuman populations included numerous restrictions that reinforced their inferior status while preventing their complete marginalization. Imperial law prohibited Abhumans from holding positions of governmental authority over baseline humans, ensuring that planetary governors, Imperial officials, and military officers above certain ranks remained exclusively baseline human. Abhumans could not own property in many jurisdictions, instead holding possessions through legal arrangements that granted them use rights while maintaining baseline human ownership. Marriage between Abhumans and baseline humans faced prohibition in most Imperial territories, with such unions classified as bestiality or genetic contamination, depending on local legal traditions. These restrictions created legal barriers that prevented Abhumans from achieving social mobility or integration into baseline human society, even when individual communities might have tolerated such advancement. Economic restrictions compounded legal limitations by channeling Abhumans into specific occupational categories that reflected their perceived capabilities and maintained clear separation from baseline human workers. Imperial labor codes designated certain jobs as appropriate for Abhuman workers while reserving others exclusively for baseline humans. Ogryns found themselves restricted to heavy labor, military service, and other occupations requiring physical strength rather than intellectual capability. Ratlings worked as scouts, snipers, or in roles requiring manual dexterity and small size, but faced exclusion from positions requiring trust or authority. These occupational restrictions operated through both formal regulations and informal discrimination, with employers who attempted to hire Abhumans for non-traditional roles facing social pressure or official sanction. The persecution faced by Abhuman communities varied in intensity across the Imperium, but remained a persistent threat that shaped Abhuman existence throughout Imperial space. Forced relocations represented one of the most common forms of official persecution, with planetary authorities ordering Abhuman populations to move from established communities to less desirable locations. These relocations typically occurred when baseline human populations expanded into areas hosting Abhuman settlements, with Imperial officials deciding that Abhuman presence interfered with proper human development of the territory. The relocations proceeded with minimal compensation or assistance, forcing Abhumans to abandon homes and communities they had occupied for generations. Resistance to relocation orders brought violent suppression, with Imperial Guard forces deployed to enforce compliance and eliminate Abhumans who refused to leave. Sterilization programs targeting Abhuman populations emerged periodically when local authorities decided that Abhuman numbers threatened to grow beyond acceptable levels. These programs operated under various justifications, including resource management, genetic hygiene, and prevention of Abhuman expansion into baseline human territories. The Adeptus Arbites enforced sterilization orders with brutal efficiency, conducting mass medical procedures on Abhuman populations regardless of individual consent or circumstances. Some programs employed permanent sterilization through surgical intervention, while others used chemical or radiation treatments that rendered Abhumans infertile while avoiding the expense and logistical complications of surgery. The psychological trauma these programs inflicted on Abhuman communities received no consideration from Imperial authorities, who viewed population control as legitimate exercise of governmental authority over non-baseline populations. Periodic purges by zealous Puritans within the Inquisition represented the most extreme form of persecution facing Abhuman communities. Inquisitors of particularly rigid ideological bent sometimes concluded that Abhuman populations in their jurisdictions represented corruption that required elimination regardless of official recognition or legal protections. These purges proceeded with inquisitorial authority that overrode local objections, with entire Abhuman communities facing extermination based on individual inquisitors' judgment that their presence threatened imperial purity. The purges typically targeted Beastmen populations, whose ambiguous status and documented chaos susceptibility made them vulnerable to inquisitorial action, but even recognized Abhuman strains faced occasional purges when Puritans decided their mutations indicated corruption. The legal protections theoretically available to Abhumans proved largely ineffective against inquisitorial purges, as inquisitors operated with authority that superseded normal imperial law. Abhuman communities targeted for purging had no meaningful recourse or appeal process, as challenging inquisitorial decisions required resources and political connections that Abhumans inherently lacked. Some planetary governors attempted to protect Abhuman populations from inquisitorial excess, arguing that sanctioned Abhuman strains deserved the legal protections imperial law granted them, but such interventions risked drawing inquisitorial scrutiny onto the governors themselves. Most imperial authorities chose to cooperate with purges rather than risk being accused of harboring corruption or opposing the Inquisition's sacred mission. The role of Abhuman populations in pilgrimages and visits to shrine worlds revealed both their inclusion in the broader imperial faith community and the discrimination they faced even in religious contexts. Abhumans participated in pilgrimages to major shrine worlds throughout the Imperium, traveling vast distances to visit sites sacred to the imperial creed and seek the emperor's blessing. These pilgrimages represented profound expressions of faith for Abhuman participants, who often saved for years to afford passage on pilgrimage ships, and who endured tremendous hardship during journeys that could span decades. The sight of Ogryn pilgrims reverently approaching sacred sites or rattling faithful making offerings at imperial shrines demonstrated that Abhumans participated fully in the religious life that unified the Imperium despite their physical differences. Shrine world authorities maintained complex and often contradictory policies regarding Abhuman pilgrims. Some sacred sites welcomed all faithful regardless of physical form, recognizing that the Emperor's grace extended to any who sought it with sincere devotion. These inclusive shrines provided accommodations for Abhuman pilgrims and conducted services accessible to worshippers of varying intellectual capabilities. Other shrine worlds restricted Abhuman access to certain areas or times, allowing them to visit but segregating them from baseline human pilgrims to avoid contamination of sacred spaces. The most rigid shrine worlds prohibited Abhuman entry entirely, with Ministorum authorities arguing that allowing mutated beings into the holiest sites of the Imperial faith represented unacceptable desecration. The specialized religious observances developed by Abhuman communities reflected their unique characteristics while remaining recognizably part of the broader Imperial creed. Ogryn religious practice emphasized simple, direct expressions of loyalty and devotion that aligned with their cognitive capabilities. They participated enthusiastically in religious festivals and holy days, though their celebrations focused more on demonstrating strength and endurance in the Emperor's service than on theological reflection. Ogryn communities sometimes held competitions of strength or endurance as religious observances, viewing physical prowess as a form of worship that honored the Emperor through demonstration of the capabilities he granted them. Rattling religious observance incorporated their cultural emphasis on food and community, with religious festivals featuring elaborate communal meals that served as acts of worship. These gatherings combined Thanksgiving prayers with the preparation and sharing of food, creating religious experiences that engaged rattling cultural values while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. Rattling communities developed traditions of offering specially prepared foods at shrines and altars, viewing culinary skill as a form of devotion that honored the Emperor through excellence in their particular talents. Some Ministorum authorities condemned these practices as inappropriately focused on worldly pleasures, while others recognized them as culturally appropriate expressions of genuine faith. The question of Abhuman redemption and their ultimate fate after death generated theological speculation that revealed deep uncertainty about their spiritual status. Conservative theologians argued that Abhumans, if they possessed souls at all, faced spiritual limitations that prevented them from achieving the full salvation available to baseline humans. These positions suggested that loyal Abhumans might receive some form of lesser reward after death, perhaps serving the Emperor in diminished capacity rather than joining him fully in whatever afterlife awaited the faithful. The most extreme conservative views held that Abhuman souls simply ceased to exist upon death, their mutations preventing them from achieving any form of spiritual continuation. Progressive theological voices insisted that the Emperor made no distinction between baseline and Abhuman souls when judging the faithful after death. They argued that Abhumans who served loyally and maintained faith throughout their lives would receive the same spiritual rewards as baseline humans, joining the Emperor in whatever form the afterlife took. This position emphasized the universality of the Emperor's love and the fundamental equality of all human souls regardless of physical form. The debate remained unresolved across millennia of theological argument, with different dioceses and preachers teaching contradictory doctrines about Abhuman spiritual fate, while the ecclesiarchy's central authorities declined to issue definitive pronouncements that might alienate either conservative or progressive factions within the Ministorum. The tearing of reality that created the Cicatrix Maledictum fundamentally altered the conditions under which Abhuman populations existed throughout Imperial space. The Great Rift's emergence split the galaxy into two distinct regions, with Imperium Nihilus on the darkness side cut off from Terra, and the Astronomican's guiding light, while Imperium Sanctus maintained connection to the Emperor's beacon, though under constant threat from warp storms bleeding through weakened reality. Abhuman populations scattered across both regions faced immediate crises, as the warp's influence saturated real space with unprecedented intensity, creating conditions that threatened the genetic stability upon which their imperial recognition depended. Isolated Abhuman communities on worlds engulfed by warp storms or trapped in Imperium nihilus experienced mutation rates that exceeded anything documented during previous periods of Imperial history. Genitor monitoring stations that maintained contact with these populations reported alarming increases in genetic instability, with Abhuman breeding populations producing offspring showing characteristics that deviated from established strain profiles. Ogryn communities on high-gravity worlds near the rift reported births of individuals displaying additional limbs, malformed skeletal structures, or cognitive degradation beyond normal Ogryn limitations. These mutations appeared randomly rather than following predictable patterns, suggesting warp influence rather than environmental adaptation as their source. Rattling populations proved similarly vulnerable to increased mutation pressure, though their symptoms manifested differently than Ogryn degradation. Reports from rattling communities in affected regions described individuals born with elongated features that exceeded normal rattling proportions, unusual sensory organs that served no apparent function, or behavioral changes that suggested neurological alterations. The mutations appeared across multiple rattling worlds simultaneously despite their geographic separation, indicating that warp saturation affected Abhuman genetics on a galactic scale rather than through localized phenomena. Genitor researchers analyzing the data concluded that the cicatrix maledictum had created conditions similar to those during the Age of Strife, when warp storms first drove the mutations that produced Abhuman strains, but now those same forces threatened to destabilize populations that had achieved genetic equilibrium over millennia. The chaos corruption of Abhuman populations accelerated dramatically in regions where the rift's influence proved strongest. Beastmen communities already vulnerable to chaos found themselves overwhelmed by demonic influence that swept through their populations like plague. Entire Beastmen settlements fell to worship of the ruinous powers within months of the rift's opening, their populations transforming into chaos cultists who launched attacks against nearby Imperial installations. The speed and completeness of these conversions suggested that warp saturation lowered the barriers that normally required active recruitment or gradual corruption, allowing chaos influence to flow directly into susceptible populations without need for cultist intermediaries. Even previously stable Abhuman strains showed increased susceptibility to chaos corruption in the new reality the rift created. Ogryn populations that had served the Imperium loyally for generations began producing individuals who heard demonic whispers or experienced visions that drew them toward chaos worship. These corrupted Ogryns sometimes infected entire units, their simple faith in authority making them vulnerable when charismatic leaders turned to the ruinous powers and commanded their followers to join them. Rattling communities experienced similar corruption, though their greater intelligence meant the process operated through more sophisticated recruitment rather than simple command. Chaos cults targeting Ratlings offered them freedom from discrimination and persecution, promising acceptance and power that the Imperium denied them, and finding receptive audiences among Abhumans ground down by generations of marginalization. Extinction events eliminated numerous small Abhuman populations that lacked the numbers or resources to survive the crises the rift's opening triggered. Isolated communities on worlds that fell to chaos incursions, tyrannid invasions, or other threats disappeared entirely, their genetic lineages ending as populations died or scattered beyond recovery. Some Abhuman strains that existed only on single worlds or small clusters of planets faced complete elimination when those worlds fell to enemy action or warp phenomena. The Administratum's records showed dozens of minor Abhuman populations classified as extinct or missing in the decades following the rift's creation, though the true number likely exceeded official counts given the communication difficulties plaguing Imperium Nihilus. The return of Primarch Roboute Guilliman and his assumption of leadership over Imperial military operations brought pragmatic reassessment of Abhuman utility in the Imperium's desperate struggle for survival. Guilliman's approach to Abhuman integration reflected his Crusade-era experience when practical military necessity outweighed ideological purity concerns. The Lord Commander of the Imperium recognized that the Indomitus Crusade required every available resource, and that Abhuman populations represented military assets the Imperium could not afford to waste through discrimination or persecution. His directives to the Adeptus Munitorum emphasized maximizing Abhuman recruitment and deployment, overriding local objections from authorities who preferred to exclude Abhumans from military service. Guilliman's pragmatism extended to direct intervention in cases where traditional prejudices threatened to waste valuable Abhuman capabilities. When planetary governors in the Ultramar region attempted to restrict Ogryn recruitment based on purity concerns, the Primarch personally countermanded their orders and mandated Abhuman conscription quotas that forced compliance. His actions sent clear signals throughout Imperial command structures that Abhuman discrimination would not be tolerated when it interfered with military effectiveness. The Primarch's authority, as both military commander and genetic son of the Emperor, gave his pronouncements weight that few Imperial officials dared challenge, creating practical protection for Abhuman populations that exceeded anything they had enjoyed in recent millennia. The integration of Abhuman forces into Indomitus Crusade operations proceeded on unprecedented scales as Guilliman's fleets pushed into Imperium Nihilus and contested regions throughout the galaxy. Ogryn regiments deployed alongside Primaris Space Marine chapters, their shock assault capabilities complementing the transhuman warriors' tactical flexibility. Rattling sniper teams attached to Imperial Guard formations throughout the Crusade, their marksmanship proving valuable in urban combat and siege operations that characterized much of the fighting. The Primarch's willingness to employ Abhumans in critical operations demonstrated that their capabilities warranted trust despite their physical differences, challenging attitudes that had marginalized these populations for generations. The practical necessities of the Indomitus Crusade forced baseline human troops to work alongside Abhuman forces whether they approved or not, creating situations where combat experience gradually eroded traditional prejudices. Soldiers who fought beside Ogryns in desperate battles developed appreciation for their resilience and strength regardless of their initial attitudes. Troops who benefited from rattling intelligence gathering or sniper support recognized the tactical advantages these Abhumans provided even if they personally found them distasteful. The shared experience of fighting for survival against overwhelming threats created bonds that transcended species differences, though these battlefield relationships often failed to translate into broader social acceptance once troops returned to garrison duties or civilian life. The emergence of new Abhuman strains in the era Indomitus resulted from the same warp instability that threatened existing populations with mutation and corruption. Human colonies isolated by the rift's creation faced environmental conditions and warp exposure that drove rapid evolutionary changes, producing populations that diverged from baseline humanity within generations rather than millennia. Janitor teams accompanying Crusade fleets documented multiple instances of accelerated mutation, with human populations developing characteristics that would normally require thousands of years of selective pressure. These new strains showed adaptations to warp-saturated environments, radiation exposure beyond previous human tolerance, and other extreme conditions that the galaxy's new reality imposed on isolated populations. Some newly emerged Abhuman populations displayed characteristics suggesting intentional adaptation rather than random mutation. Communities that survived on demon worlds or in regions where reality itself proved unstable developed traits that allowed them to perceive and navigate warp phenomena that would drive baseline humans insane. These populations showed unusual neural structures, altered sensory organs that detected psychic emanations, and psychological characteristics that provided resistance to demonic influence through mechanisms genitor researchers struggled to understand. The question of whether these adaptations represented natural evolution or warp-induced mutation generated intense debate, as the traits proved useful for survival in the new galaxy, while simultaneously suggesting corruption that might disqualify these populations from Imperial recognition. Environmental catastrophes triggered by the rift's opening drove other rapid evolutionary changes in human populations trapped on affected worlds. Planets where the warp's influence altered fundamental physical laws saw their human populations adapt or die, with survivors developing characteristics that allowed function in environments that violated normal reality. Some populations developed resistance to temporal distortions, their biological processes continuing normally even when local time flow became erratic or non-linear. Others showed adaptation to gravity fluctuations, toxic atmospheres that appeared spontaneously, or radiation levels that spiked without warning. These emergency adaptations produced populations that diverged dramatically from baseline humanity within single generations, creating abhuman strains that bore little resemblance to their ancestors. The accelerated evolution of isolated populations created classification challenges for Imperial authorities attempting to determine which new strains warranted recognition and which represented unstable mutant stocks requiring extermination. Traditional evaluation criteria emphasized genetic stability across generations, but newly emerged populations lacked the generational depth necessary for assessing long-term stability. Genitor teams could document that populations bred true in the short term, producing offspring with consistent characteristics, but they could not predict whether these traits would remain stable over the centuries or millennia that defined recognized abhuman strains. The uncertainty forced Imperial authorities to make classification decisions based on incomplete information, accepting some populations provisionally, while condemning others whose mutations suggested warp taint or genetic instability. The debate over genetic purity intensified as the Imperium confronted the reality that baseline humanity itself faced increasing mutation pressure from warp saturation. Conservative factions within the Adeptus Terra argued for stricter purity standards and more aggressive elimination of mutant populations, viewing the increased mutation rates as existential threats requiring harsh response. These authorities advocated for expanded purges, targeting not just obvious mutants, but also populations showing any deviation from established human norms, including some recognized abhuman strains whose genetic stability appeared questionable under new conditions. The conservative position held that preserving humanity's genetic integrity required ruthless elimination of all variant populations before mutations spread beyond control. Progressive voices countered that rigid purity standards proved counterproductive when humanity faced threats that required every available resource for survival. They argued that abhuman populations represented valuable military and economic assets that the Imperium could not afford to eliminate based on ideological concerns. The practical necessities of defending against chaos incursions, tyrannid invasions, and Xenos threats throughout the galaxy demanded acceptance of genetic diversity as the price of survival. These authorities pointed out that many newly emerged abhuman populations showed adaptations that allowed human survival in conditions where baseline humans simply died, suggesting that genetic flexibility represented humanity's best hope for enduring the galaxy's new reality rather than a threat to be eliminated. The question of what constituted humanity in the 42nd millennium forced Imperial authorities to confront fundamental assumptions about human identity and the boundaries of acceptable variation. The traditional definition based on genetic similarity to baseline human norms proved increasingly difficult to maintain when warp influence drove rapid changes across human populations throughout the galaxy. Some Imperial philosophers argued for expanded definitions that emphasized psychological and cultural characteristics rather than pure genetics, suggesting that any population that maintained human consciousness, used language, and demonstrated capacity for faith in the Emperor qualified as human regardless of physical form. This position faced fierce opposition from conservatives who insisted that physical form mattered fundamentally, and that abandoning genetic standards would lead to accepting corrupted populations as human. The theological implications of redefining humanity generated intense debate within the Adeptus Ministorum as the ecclesiarchy grappled with questions about which populations deserved recognition as the emperor's subjects. Progressive preachers argued that the emperor's domain encompassed all beings descended from human stock, regardless of their current physical characteristics, and that excluding populations based on mutation represented abandonment of the emperor's children. Conservative theologians maintained that the emperor created humanity in a specific form, and that significant deviation from that template indicated spiritual as well as physical corruption. The debate remained unresolved as different dioceses implemented contradictory policies, with some shrine worlds welcoming all human-derived populations, while others enforced strict purity standards that excluded even recognized Abhuman strains. The survival necessity argument gained strength as the Imperium's military situation grew increasingly desperate across both sides of the rift. Every Abhuman regiment, every mutant labor gang, every population capable of contributing to the Imperial war effort represented resources that might prove decisive in local conflicts, even if they remained statistically insignificant on the galactic scale. Military commanders facing overwhelming enemy forces learned to accept whatever troops they could get regardless of genetic purity, calculating that Abhuman soldiers who could hold positions and kill enemies provided more value than maintaining ideological consistency. The pragmatic approach spread through Imperial military structures as officers recognized that survival required setting aside prejudices that reduced combat effectiveness. The long-term trajectory of Abhuman populations remained uncertain as the Imperium struggled through the early decades of the era Indomitus. Some genitor researchers predicted that increased mutation pressure would destabilize existing Abhuman strains, forcing reclassification or extinction as populations diverged beyond recognition. Others suggested that Abhuman populations might prove more resilient than baseline humans to warp influence, their already altered genomes showing greater flexibility in responding to new environmental pressures. The possibility existed that future generations might see Abhuman populations expanding while baseline humanity declined, reversing traditional hierarchies and forcing fundamental reassessment of what constituted the Imperium's core population. The integration of Primaris Space Marines into the Adeptus Astartes created precedents that influenced discussions about Abhuman status and genetic modification. The Primaris represented intentional genetic enhancement of already transhuman warriors, demonstrating that genetic modification could produce superior soldiers when properly controlled. Some Imperial authorities argued that Abhuman populations deserved similar investment in enhancement programs that could maximize their military utility while addressing their limitations. Others warned that attempting to enhance Abhumans risked creating uncontrollable mutations or producing populations that diverged even further from baseline humanity. The debate paralleled broader discussions about the Primaris themselves and whether their creation represented acceptable innovation or dangerous deviation from the Emperor's original designs. The question of Abhuman representation in Imperial governance emerged as some populations began demanding recognition beyond their traditional roles as laborers and soldiers. Abhuman communities that maintained loyalty and service through the rift's opening argued that their contributions warranted political representation and voice in decisions affecting their populations. These demands faced resistance from Imperial authorities, who maintained that governance remained the exclusive domain of baseline humanity. But some progressive planetary governors began appointing Abhuman advisors or establishing consultation mechanisms that gave these populations limited input on policies affecting them. The experiments remained isolated and controversial, but they suggested possible futures where Abhumans achieved greater integration into Imperial society. The Imperium's future relationship with its Abhuman populations would ultimately be determined by the same forces that shaped all Imperial policy: military necessity, theological doctrine, and the grinding realities of survival in a galaxy that offered no certainty beyond constant war. The Abhuman strains that endured would be those that proved their utility to Imperial operations while maintaining sufficient genetic stability to avoid classification as mutant threats. Those that failed either test faced extinction through enemy action, Imperial purges, or simple abandonment. As the Imperium prioritized resources toward populations it deemed more valuable or reliable. The harsh calculus offered no guarantees, no promises of protection or recognition, only the possibility that service and sacrifice might earn continued existence in an Imperium that had never shown mercy to those it considered expendable. The Abhuman populations scattered across the Imperium's million worlds faced their uncertain future with the same grim determination that had allowed their ancestors to survive the Age of Strife. They served in the Emperor's armies, labored in his factories, and maintained faith in his protection despite centuries of discrimination and persecution. Whether that service would prove sufficient to secure their place in humanity's future remained unknown, but the Abhumans endured because they possessed no alternative. They were human enough to serve the Imperium, different enough to face eternal suspicion, and numerous enough that their fate would help determine whether humanity itself survived the darkness that had engulfed the galaxy. Their story continued not toward any certain resolution, but simply forward through the endless war that defined existence in the 41st millennium and beyond, where every day brought fresh threats, and where survival itself represented the only victory that mattered.